Just let me do one last thing real quick.
It's live right now.
Okay, so welcome to our final class of Accelerate the Accelerationism Reader. And today we have a very special guest, Benjamin Noys. Benjamin Noys has been a very interesting and kind of persistently influential thinker, influenced somewhat by Paul Virilio and a variety of other thinkers dealing with the question of speed, and most recently dealing with the question of accelerationism, and offering the first full book-length critique of the concept of accelerationism. And so today, how we're going to approach this course meeting is that he will we'll start off with Benjamin doing a probably about a 15-20 minute talk dealing with some of his critiques of accelerationism, perhaps some of the history of accelerationism. I'm not sure, and then after that we'll have kind of a group discussion with him, and then we'll move on to student presentations on the readings, both of which today are Leotard from his from the period where he was dealing with particularly dealing with Deleuze and Guattari in Energymen Capitalism, and then also some of his work on libidinal economy. Sorry. So that will be very interesting. And from what I found, this Energymen Capitalism reading is not particularly widely available, except in this book. So that'll be super interesting. So so with that, I'll just turn it over to Benjamin, and
Thanks, Joe, Jason, sorry, and thanks, Mohammed, for inviting me. The talk is sort of the paper that I sent. Is that okay, or if
absolutely?
Just because I don't want to read out something people have already read.
Yeah.
But I mean, partly what I'm starting with is the difficulty and the simpleness of what accelerationism is. So on the one hand, there's a simple definition, which is accelerationism is the engagement with forms and forces of technology and abstraction that must selectively be accelerated to punch through the limits of a stagnant and inertial capitalism. So that's the one-line definition that I have. On the other hand, what I think is interesting and what seems to make the debate so difficult is it's very difficult to grasp what accelerationism is because of the multiple forms and types of acceleration, even if that's the right name for it. So redesigning has been suggested, Mackenzie Walk suggests extrapolation. We don't seem to know what accelerationism is, what it could be or could do. Maybe we need to create 2, 3, or many accelerationisms, to quote Che Guevara. And I think, as you've been looking at it, this is the tension that's in the Accelerate reader, like everyone else. My free copy, because it would have annoyed me too much to buy. And the reader itself, on the one hand, it's a great slab. There's 536 pages of it, so there's a lot of accelerationism. On the other hand, what's interesting is there's not so much explicit accelerationism, depending on when you start numbering it. So whether it's third or fourth wave accelerationism we're currently up to, after the 70s French moment 1, Nick Land 2, and now Alex and others 3, or Marx, 70s French moment, Nick Land 4, or if you include the various avant-gardes, 5, 6, 7. So one way I think to approach the Accelerate reader is itself as an accelerator, that it's designed to generate what it's talking about. It's a performative text, or in the language of the CCRU, Cybernetic Cultures Research Unit, it's a hyperstitional text. It's trying to create an origin or a fiction of origins for accelerationism, generate a kind of myth. And one of the things that it does, or one of the things that accelerationists do, at least in my kind of experience of giving talks to them and about them, is that the reader is a kind of Borgesian parable that announces accelerationism and also wants to say that we're already accelerationists, or most of us are. So one of the kind of moves that people make is to say you reject accelerationism, but you really are an accelerationist, if you think about it. So the reader does this by saying accelerationism is something new. It's a new thing, you know, the kind of discourse of fad or fashion, which is constant in theory for at least 30 or 40 or 50 years. It's a new thing. On the other hand, accelerationism has always been with us. So what's proclaimed in the reader is a truth that permeates the thinking of modernity, or is even synonymous with modernity. So there's a claim that accelerationism and modernity are the same thing. Take a kind of Marshall Berman reading of modernity is all that solid melts into air. At the same time as announcing the good news in the evangelical fashion, it's a story of normalization. Accelerationism is not simply the name for a new movement, but it already exists. It's something that's already been happening. And it's this kind of instability between accelerationism being announced and it being a problem or something that we should do that is central to the kind of debates. Not all of us accelerate. There are those of us, me being one, that are definitely not accelerationists. The practitioners of localism or folk politics, kitsch Marxists, paleo-Heideggerians, recidivist Aldonians, etc. These non-accelerationists fall, according to the accelerationists, outside of modernity. They themselves, or we, or me, are nostalgic remnants of the past, trapped in time, the Miss Havishams of theory, to borrow from Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. The character who once jilted remains frozen in that moment of time. And it's this image that speaks to the core of the dismissal of anti-accelerationism. It, or we, cannot imagine a future. This is the break or the rupture or the dividing line, I think, between accelerationists and anti-accelerationists. It's a kind of core issue. Of course, such a line is very vague. The real division lies between those able to affirm a positive vision of the future based on the development of technology, abstraction, and reason, accelerationists, and those unwilling or unable to. In the second case, we find those who see the future as potentially or actually catastrophic, usually due to climate change, but also due to the persistence of capitalism. Those who imagine a future which is retrograde, in accelerationist terms. Those who refuse technology or want to return to the local or natural. And those who refuse to speculate on the future, except in the sense of grasping the current limits and possibilities of contemporary struggles. And that would be communisation. So there's a kind of interesting choice of accelerationists to constantly debate with communisers. Now, one of the things to say is that these refusals of the future, I think, are quite kind of minority positions. They're not that dominant on the left or alternative scene, whatever you want to call it. And certainly both in everyday life and in struggles, many contemporary movements have made extensive use of technology, notably social media, although we should avoid exaggeration of the Twitter, Facebook, sole or major drivers of struggle. This use of social media, however, opens the gate for accelerationists to argue that these movements are nascent accelerationists, often unwilling or unable to follow through with the use of technology. They are using technology as if it were a temporary measure when it should be embraced the possibility of a new platform or stack that can embed and articulate a global political alternative. So again, the accelerationist response is one more effort to properly embrace technology. So contemporary accelerationism, Alex Nix, the efflux issue, the sort of few texts that we have, articulates itself as a platform or a stack or a hegemonic project. If a stack is, as Benjamin Bratton says, a vast, if also incomplete, and pervasive, if also irregular thing, I don't think it's a bad schema for understanding accelerationism. Accelerationism is vast but incomplete, and pervasive but irregular. So we can understand accelerationism at the moment as a stack of different elements, and the layers of this stack seem to me to go along fairly traditional disciplinary divisions, which perhaps maybe does some violence to their kind of range of thought, but I'm going to do that. There's the philosophical layer, which is a radical and inhuman Prometheanism articulated through reason as a site which explores and proposes norms that reinvent the human in the form of global reason. This is Reza's project. The political layer, the manifesto, as the statement of a new hegemonic project for the left, organized through the embrace of planning, abstraction, and a global horizon as the condition to overcome inertial capitalism. And the experimental, the aesthetic accelerationism as a probe to grasp or analyse the contemporary moment it's overcoming in the efflux issue, or in Steve Shaviro's forthcoming book. Now, while the aesthetic or the experimental might appear the most lowly layer, mere practice to the queen of philosophy, it plays a crucial, I think, and even determining role. It's crucial to the very name accelerationism, which itself is an aesthetic gesture. Accelerationism provides the oomph, the edge, the speed that other signifiers wouldn't. So in the discussions around accelerationism I've had in London, people will say, well, it's not really accelerationism as it used to be. It's not Nick Land's accelerationism. It doesn't really mean speeding up, but we still need the name. We like the name. It can convey something important. And the aesthetic invocations by accelerationism of everything from dance music to the imaging of data are essential, I think, as a kind of necessary supplement in Derrida's sense, i.e. they're additional but required. They galvanise and libidinise a project that, while undoubtedly ambitious, would otherwise join with a whole series of attempts to re-engineer the world. So if accelerationism lost the name, it would just be another project, another perhaps reformist project. It's accelerationism that gives it the extra edge that makes it a revolutionary project in its own terms. And this is where I think one of my kind of criticisms, or many of my criticisms, start. I think my problem with it is not this, that it is an aesthetic per se. It's not that it lacks substance, that it's just a kind of gimmick. It's that its conception of substance is wrong, I think. I mean, I've also talked, which comes up in the book, about the problem of the subject of accelerationism. Who is doing the accelerating and what is being accelerated? This is the point that Simon O'Sullivan talks about in his review recently of The Reader for Mute. But I think substance is also important. And my contention is that accelerationism has too much substance. I mean that in the sense that accelerationism accepts an image of substance, an image of the world and its forces that integrates, deliberately it's true, with that world in a way that allows it little critical access to the question of substance. It accepts too much of the world. And this is my rather unfortunate fecal pre-Socratic parody of these different modes of substance. So we can have two axes, hot to cold and solid to liquid. And I think accelerationism's imagery of itself is cold and liquid, at least going back to Nick Land. So following the axes, we could locate with Beatrice Preciado capitalism as hot liquid. She talks about hot psychotropic punk capitalism. And then the two other zones in my square, which would remain, hot solid and cold solid, would be the kind of inertial forms that accelerationism tries to overcome. Hot solid for capitalist restraint of the productive forces in the various models of capitalism as feta that you find in Marx, and cold solid as the resistance predicated on the return or recovery of the virtues of what Levi-Strauss used to call cold societies, primitivism. So my criticism, as I said, is that there's a flattening and simplification in this modelling of substance. And this criticism I'm making has a long and familiar philosophical history. It goes back to Hegel's critique of Spinoza. Hegel's Spinozan substance is inert, encompassing all, it has no movement, and the negative is thrown out to become nothing with a capital N. Grand nothing. And this, I think, is important because the debate about negativity has become, which I looked at in my previous book, kind of a key issue around accelerationism. It's not a matter of celebrating negativity with a capital N as opposing accelerationism, and in fact I think accelerationism itself tends to do that in some of its forms. The image of substance as this cold liquid allows it to project also this image of a capital N negativity. So we have Hegel's critique of Spinoza, and Badiou, borrowing from Hegel, makes a similar critique of Negri, who can be seen as a kind of accelerationist. That Negri accepts the forces of the world as the only substance that can be acted upon. So my problem, as I've said, is that this concept of substance as a cold liquid is a deliberate flattening of difference and the human into an inhuman immanence that exceeds the limited substance of capitalism. Capitalism must be called to be exceeded or accelerated. So one way to challenge this flattening is through the question of labour, which is what I focused on in the little book that's coming out with Zero. I think that accelerationism at its core has often the problem of labour. What Marx called the moving contradiction, the fact that capitalism needs labour to produce value, but eliminates labour through the use of machines and technology. But my contention is that accelerationism offers a false solution. The integration of labour into the abstract and the machinic, the identification with substance, with the solvent forces of cold, liquid, is an attempt to exit from the contradiction and to escape labour, per se. Which doesn't escape, it leads back in. So the exit leads back in. Similarly, you could say the same, not about just about labour as a commodity, but about all commodities, about objects. The identification of the object with the commodity as a cold abstraction or cold liquefaction flattens the processes by which capitalism constantly transforms objects into commodities through the value form. So I think there's a kind of identification with the final result, the abstract, the cold, the extreme point, hence the kind of fascination with things like high-frequency trading. Choose the most extreme point of abstraction rather than tracing the processes of transformation. Now, just to conclude, there are a few things that accelerationists can and do say back to me, which may be right. The first is that this critique of accelerationism, contemporary accelerationism, is unfair because really I'm criticising Landian, Nick Land's version of accelerationism. So while I think it's true that Nick and Alex and others constantly point to problems in Land, Ray, perhaps Rassier most successfully in his introduction to the collected writings, there's still a use of Landian imagery. There's still a kind of seemingly slightly strange need for land as a kind of driver of this. And still a need for a kind of image of radical immanence, whether that's circuited through Nick Land's work or through an embrace of the global, the abstract, the inhuman. So this is a problem, I think. The second charge, which is the one that everyone makes to me, is that of being a kitsch Marxist. Well, not to me, but uses it as a label. Now, as far as I can tell, the accusation of kitsch Marxism is that if you refuse to think substance, refuse to think this integration, then you abandon any reference to the present and enter a world where everything's bad and wrong. You basically give up on dealing with the world. Substance has to be dealt with. This is what Nick Land calls transcendental miserabilism, basically trying to escape from the world. Now, my response to that is that I am not abandoning substance. I'm not, and in fact, I'm quite concerned with it, primarily through the concept of decommodification. So rather than re-engineering or extrapolation at the end of the book, I'm most concerned with ways in which we could decommodify forms, social and political. So I had a discussion with Ray Brassier in Berlin, where we were talking about antibiotics. So the kind of line is, you know, do you want to get rid of antibiotics? No, I don't, because I don't want to die. I'm against my own death. But what I said to him there was I was not so much concerned with a future without antibiotics in some revolution, but the distribution of antibiotics now, the distribution of technologies and these forms at the present. So the battle for the future, to make an obligatory Terminator reference, is, I think, being fought here and now. What future we have cannot be left to the future, but involves struggles over the stakes of substance, including ignition and including the violently uneven distribution of the substances to sustain life, that cannot be deferred or regarded as simply requiring a technological solution. Sorry, I'm also reading all the comments down the side of the screen. I started to read them, so you can now put them into words. Slightly eerie, seeing like being in a class where you can see the students' notes. You never want to do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't think they are their students' notes. I think they're just like little interventions.
Yeah,
To
comments. Yeah, it's just
spice.
I've never done this, so it's just.
It's consciously trying to spice up the conversation.
Yeah, no, it's good. Yeah. It's instant questions. That's kind of. It's good. I didn't go to Burning Man.
Yeah, that's one of the 10 principles that's bandied about, and it's really an example of this non-political New Ageism, which is extremely prevalent and is an extreme distraction in many cases. And even the whole fact that it's a festival for a week where people think they can withdraw for a week and therefore they're creating the seeds of utopia. There is a desire for utopia, which is commendable, but it's really emblematic of a lot of this, not proper left thinkers, but sort of mainstream people who consider themselves progressive, who see something wrong with capital and try to do things in a certain way. So you were mentioning how you didn't think this anti-accelerationist sentiment is very prevalent. And that's why I put a comment. I think that New Age thing is very prevalent, and it is based on a fundamental disavowal between the relationship to technology, to an extent. So Burning Man is only possible because of enormous expenditure in commodities, in technology, and then for a week people will pretend that all of that doesn't exist, and they're living an unmediated, pure existence. And I do hearken a lot back to Frankfurt School, thinking that, Adorno's sort of leisure time or critique of leisure time and hobbies would exactly correspond to that. So, yeah, what do you think of sort of that prevalence of sentiment? And accelerations as a counter to actually that widespread disavowal.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of how widespread it is an interesting one, because I think it also speaks to national and distributions of sentiment, because I think, at least my perception in the UK, is that kind of New Age thinking is less dominant on the left because we don't have so much of an outside.
Yeah.
We are much more geographically limited, and it's much harder to imagine have the American fantasy of the great forest that you actually have, whereas we do have forests, but they're not so large. So I think there is that national distribution, but I think accelerationism, is why it's linked to communisation, why I've written on it, why we're all thinking the same thing. Is accelerationism insists there is no outside, and I think that's true. I think that's a merit to its position. It's not the fantasy of the outside is generated by being inside.
Could you say a little bit about what you feel the relationship is between communisation and accelerationism?
Yeah.
That's another out. I mean, I don't know exactly. I mean, my sketch of it is that it's a kind of symmetry of response. So there are both two responses to the same situation, which is a strong felt sense or reality of the closure of the horizon of capital. So what people call real subsumption, like you were saying, leisure time, everything is subsumed. So the two, accelerationism responds by, as you know, kind of trying to retool technological elements, engage with abstractions, accelerate selectively elements of that, whereas communisation stresses that the dynamic of class struggle in that real complete subsumption doesn't mean class struggle has ended in a kind of bad, some of the slightly bad versions of Frankfurt School argument, we're totally integrated. It means that capitalism has abandoned workers' identity, doesn't require workers, so new forms of struggle emerge. So I think that's where the symmetry lies, in this kind of convergence on there is no outside. I mean, I was surprised in Berlin that so many, Ray and Nick and Alex, were all talking about communisation. So I wasn't expecting that kind of discussion between them. I mean, I think part of the problem is that they then see communisation as kitsch Marxism, as the symptom that it's Marxism that refuses to imagine a future.
So if that's the convergence, where's the essential difference. I started to read Ray's piece. I haven't finished The Wandering Extraction, where he does compare communization. But what's the fundamental divergence then between communization and accelerationism?
I mean, I think that point about the communization is about class struggle primarily, and class struggle as a dynamic of the labour relation. So between, you know, in their periodization, what they argue is that workers' identity is no longer crucial to capital. So you have a new emergent form of struggle, which is struggle against the identity of the worker. Whereas, at least I think, I mean, we're talking about work that's still ongoing, but Alex and Nick's argument is for you know, a new hegemonic project that would engage with technology, develop a platform model, you know, in some ways more structured organization. You know, we're all waiting for their book. But you know, I feel like traditional class struggle versus a kind of technological organizational hegemonic model.
But they yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I agree with you, and I wouldn't even waste my time on accelerationism if it didn't maintain that class and those Marxist notions of class struggle. I think it would just then be another reformist project, I believe. But the issue of global organization seems to be a fundamental one, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because the only response to capital has to be a global one, and a form of organization is essential. Would you say that? I wouldn't say that acceleration ignores the class problem. It's almost
if I could just throw one more thing in for Benjamin to respond to, it's I wanted to think just briefly about the fact. I mean, they are talking about automation creating just huge populations of unemployed and unemployable people, and therefore they do call for a reform, although it's a pretty major reform. For a guaranteed basic income that would be, you know, actually livable for everybody, and so that's not revolutionary for sure, but it maybe changes the position of the potential for revolution if you have some kind of a guarantee that being unemployed will not mean, you know, homelessness.
Yeah, I mean, I think someone said to me, might have been Alberto, you know, in the present moment, reformist demands are revolutionary, because the horizon of political change is so closed and narrow, I mean, both in the US and the UK, in different ways, living under sort of soft but pretty hard neoliberal regimes. You know, there isn't much alternative. So things like basic income, you know, I talk about decommodification. I mean, there's a similar point. You know, it's finding ways for people to sustain life outside against the value relation, because currently we're all totally subject to it in various different ways and degrees. So I don't have a problem with that kind of retooling or, you know, posing the question of global organization. But I do have a problem with the kind of rhetoric and some of the substance of the proposals, and at least as I've read the manifesto and the text by Alex and Nick that they've been kind enough to send me, you know, I think there's some instability about, you know, where class struggle and acceleration relate. You know, is it class struggle is the driver for revolution, and then after the revolution we use accelerationist measures, or accelerationist measures things to be done now? You know, what would it actually mean? You know, their text on, which is still coming out, I think, and might have changed since I looked at it, on high frequency trading. It's like, well, this is the kind of grasp engaging with the abstract, but it's totally capitalist. So I'm not saying I've got better answers than them, but it seems to me they keep running into that problem. You know, that tension between how would you actually engage and reuse these things. So therefore, to me, it becomes a sort of a gestural game. And then also I have some queries about the notion of organisation becomes a kind of substitutionist project where it's led by particular accelerationists, as, you know, in a kind of almost parodic Leninism. So I'm not saying, you know, I think there's a tension there between, you know, I don't believe in a kind of completely spontaneous revolution that emerges globally through the simple facts of class struggle. So I think there's always going to be a problem of organisation. You can't just pretend that's going to go away. At the same time, some of their solutions seem to me problematic, quite traditional, and not to really have engaged with the attempts to do those sorts of things before. You know, these proposals have been made again and again. So
Would you agree that?
Sorry, I would like to. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
I want to like change the chapter of the discussion and go to a different chapter of the discussion. The chapter I want to visit is the chapter of philosophy, or more specifically, the relationship between science and philosophy, particularly epistemology and ontology, maybe a little bit, and talk about how I started with this, that like my interest in acceleration from the get-go of the manifesto was not so much of what's in it already or what is being defined as acceleration, but like as a new set of proposals, its youth allows different interested parties to be able to shape it and influence it positively or negatively. And I'm sure you are having some form of a influence on it negatively by constantly going after it, right? And other peoples are contributing to it positively, right? And this is why all of us on the positive side, negative side, are interested in acceleration, is because I think it's something that is new, you know, and through discourse and discussion and arguments can be refocused or changed, right? Now that's my point of entry into sort of like why I am interested in it. But my interest and the way I understand it is philosophically, and you can trace that in what mostly Ray Brazier and Reza talks about, really is sort of like acceleration points out to the insufficiencies of late 20th century philosophy to deal with the advancement in science, and tries to sort of like basically break away from the kind of understand, and this is sort of like, I'm going to grossly simplify in order to make a point. So if you come back and tell me you're simplifying, it's not going to work.
They may do.
So basically, it's trying to come up with the deficiencies of particularly continental philosophy after the World War II, and sort of like how a sort of like Heideggerian and Nietzschean kind of understanding of the world kind of like corrupted continental philosophy, and sort of like allowed the division that were already set by teachers of Husserl and Heidegger, right? Like Dilthey, into like human sciences are over there, and you know what I mean, like human sciences are over there and natural sciences are over there, and divide these things up, and then sciences, because of mostly the event of cybernetics, sciences and cybernetics kind of like went into like a fast speed mode of going on their own, and philosophers just like began basically going to their own philosophical Burning Man. And that's really, you get that. And you know what I mean, like the two things that happens, to the way I understand it, that causes that corruption of continental philosophy is sort of like what Heidegger does to sort of like Husserl and Bergson, which are sort of like, because to me there's some affinities between real science and early phenomenologies of Husserl and Bergson. In fact, Norbert Wiener talks about the time of the machine is a Bergsonian time. There's a chapter, the first chapter I think of Cybernetic book, it's called Bergsonian versus Newtonian time, right? But what Heidegger kind of did to that was kind of corrupted it with a whole sets of like mystification and enchantment. And then that happened to a Marxist acceleration through like the injection of Freud to Marx. And you get Frankfurt School, and then you get post-structuralism, and then the rest of the 20th century, basically, philosophy and what we call critical thought wastes its time into some form of like a very folk version and flat understanding, or manifest image, to use Sellers, manifest image understanding of really the impact of cybernetics on science, politics, economy. And really now what interests me is how with acceleration the movement is to try to put the philosophy back, or let the philosophy catch up and try to deal with really these scientific breakthroughs that kind of took place in 20th centuries in neurosciences, in physics, in chemistry, in biology, really like went on its own, independent from psychoanalysis, from continental philosophy, from sociology, and from, like, I don't know, urban geography and all sorts of other stuff that sort of anthropology that claimed to sort of like really engage with the 20th century, or really engage with late capital and all that.
Well, I am going to say it's a cliche and it's a flattened image, because I think that's important, because that's part of my contention, is what acceleration is doing isn't that new. You know, that's one way to construct the history of 20th century philosophy. You know, there are other ways to construct that history, you know, which were engaged with science, from, you know, Althusser's interest in science, that Canguilhem tradition in France, to, you know, not a big Deleuze fan, but, you know, to Deleuze, to, you know, Anglo-American philosophy. I mean, Ian Hacking, in his book on Anglo-American philosophy of science, also quips, you know, philosophy of science is just bad philosophy and no good for science. You know, there's been skepticism on the Anglo-American side about the role of philosophy in science. So there's a symmetry about skepticism, but there is also, I think, symmetries about engagement before we get to, you know, Donna Haraway or various other kinds of engagement. Stiegler's work. You know, I am an old Derridean, so I think Derrida did engage with questions of technology. You know, I don't think post-structuralism is always a particularly useful category when it's sort of just used as to mean linguistic idealism. So I think it's important to note there is that other tradition, because that eats into the construction of newness, and it's like, we're so new, no one's ever done this. You know, that's a kind of false image, because it doesn't go back to looking at the questions or problems that have arisen from trying to do that. The other thing is just...
I think I agree with you.
Just one more point. The other thing is, which I said, which is not a sophisticated philosophical point, it's a very vulgar and dull point, which I said to Robin and Ray and people in London, is, you know, I'm not going to read Brandon and Sellers. You know, I just don't find that articulation particularly interesting, and I don't find it particularly, you know, new or cutting edge. So I enjoyed Ray's book Nihil Unbound, with obvious reservations about certain things. You know, I know he's still developing his work and Reza's still developing that work, but I find the kind of norms, random Sellers stuff just doesn't interest me, and I'm not sure that it is fulfilling this sort of function of engaging philosophy with science. You know, that's my query. Is it really bringing home that logic? What
would be then a good philosophical project? to engage with, yeah.
I mean, I'm not a philosopher employed or do it particularly. I mean, I think there are lots of interesting people working on this stuff. I mean, there's lots of different philosophical things going on. I mean, I'm interested to read the new Urbanomics Speculative Aesthetics Reader. You know, I think Ray's work is interesting. I prefer the earlier work. You know, James Trafford is doing interesting work. You know, I'm not saying, I kind of think that 1,000 flowers bloom, let people do particular things. I haven't found the speculative realism thing particularly convincing or engaging. You know, I'm probably better at pointing out things that I'm skeptical about than saying here's a great positive project. But I mean, I think, you know, if people are working in the field of philosophy, they can pose their own problems for themselves. You know, so.
Speaking of that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to, you know, say, you know, it's not about, I can't just put people off. If if people are convinced accelerationists or convinced this, you know, and a critique doesn't stop anyone doing anything. It's more a kind of, you know, expression of my concern about particular things and what I think are misposed problems.
Well, what's wrong with norms as long as they're revisable? And what's wrong with basically going and basically saying, like, maybe we can all start from where our current sciences have agreed upon as the basis of the world, as long as we're willing to.
Can I make
as long as we're willing to update and revise this normativity.
Can I make an intervention here, Mo and Benjamin? And I think it's one that speaks to what Benjamin's saying. It speaks to what Mo's saying. Is that, and I'm taking what Benjamin said with regards to the problem of substance, and and when he brought up Hegel's critique of Spinoza, it reminded me of Hegel's Hegel's bypassing of Latin America and other places in sort of the dialectical development of the spirit, right? You know, obviously we arrive at this point, and this is a vulgar point too, but what I've seen a lot of accelerationists doing, and I know that there are people engaging with this, is bypassing this very critical question of substance, as if science were this monolithic hegemonic practice that articulates itself indifferently, to use Lyotard's own terms, across national, regional, and local boundaries, to the extent that, you know, I don't think it's a failure of philosophy in many ways to account for its own success. Quite on the contrary, I think it's philosophy misassessing its success as sort of either Deleuze and Guattari's account of things, or whomever, maybe Marx. I think the question is, contemporary critiques of technoscience have really articulated the national, the local, the legal, the juridical, local frames. And this problem of acceleration of substance is totally bypassing power itself. In other words, substance is a cold liquid. It has its power to extend itself, but yet when other forms of power articulate it, I mean, I just see what Benjamin's saying is very, very powerful, especially as a scholar of Latin America and a scholar of decolonial traditions. It's like science is a power structure involved with other forms of power that have kind of consubstantial connections and substantial differences. So that's my take, and I wanted to know what.
It's easy to conflate the material substance of science, or the scientific ideal or scientific process that is sort of like sometimes coincide with the substance of science and sometimes doesn't. And when I was talking about science, I wasn't talking about the corporate. In fact, to me, the political edge of acceleration is indirectly they want to liberate the science before it's too late from its complete subsumption by capital, because they see that science is probably science and knowledge, like universities, as the only areas that has not gone through the what we call real subsumption or total subsumption, right? So by proposing a kind of ideal science, I think the attempt is to maybe save the science from its total subsumption. And I really personally don't think that we can foreclose on sciences the way we can foreclose on, say, pop music, or we can foreclose on filmmaking or something, you know?
And you could also say that even if science is a form of power, I guess if there are no relations that are outside of power, then the challenge would be to kind of create this in a way, maybe.
All right, I'm going to leave with this. What you three, including Benjamin, are saying, and I think Benjamin has articulated. I don't hear Brassier or Nick or Alex or Robin saying. I think you guys are giving very generous and in point of fact, sort of dialectically informed rereadings of accelerationism, which I think is Benjamin seems to be putting in play. Is let's get back to dialectics. Let's get back to something as the agent of history that is made out of material conditions, people, things. I mean, that's what I sort of hear you saying, Benjamin. I don't know if I'm on it, but yeah. I think you guys are really nice accelerationists. Maybe that's the real thing. Nice accelerationists are shitty ones. Like, I don't mean shitty, like mean ones.
But Nick was here 2 days ago with us, and I think what I'm talking about, you could hear echoes of it in Nick's presentation to the class. So maybe Nick is also a nice accelerationist.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I was saying at the start. I mean, I think, you know, obviously got the criticisms, you know, but I think there's still not been enough articulated. I think that's a genuine thing. We're talking about something that is very amorphous. You know, that's maybe that's a problem. Maybe that's something we shouldn't do. I mean, it's, you know, but that's what's happening. It's very hard to define what the object is we're talking about. But I mean, I would agree with the previous point about, you know, the inflation of science with a capital S, as though, you know, we have to save that or not. You know, this kind of inflation of enlightenment, as, you know, it's like, are you for or against enlightenment? It just seems to me a completely ridiculous, you know, way of posing the question. You know, it's like, I'm not giving up on, you know, quote unquote enlightenment values, but that's such a kind of can of worms as to what enlightenment you mean, what kind of philosophical values you're interrogating. So I think there is these kind of polemical gestures about, you know, which side are you on, for science or against science? You know, I'm going to have, you know, the pain-killing jab when I go to the dentist. You know, it's like, I'm not stupid, you know.
You'd be surprised how many people talk about home births and the joy of the pain they experienced during childbirth was just the most liberating thing. On my Facebook, I'm just crowded with that. Like, there was someone who posted, an artist who had a home birth, and she videoed the whole thing, and everyone was saying how beautiful it was. I was just surprised. It was disgusting. It was painful. It was like everything we're fighting, you know, that's wrong.
Yes. Body is not always good. But I mean, I think, so yeah, so it's a tension between these sorts of levels of claim. On the one hand, you know, fighting for science, and then what would it mean to, as we were talking about, to engage with it, to actually reuse it, to, like you were suggesting, liberate it, as again, as if these debates, you know, hadn't been engaged with before, you know, in the 60s, 70s, with people trying to, you know, around particular areas, not just psychiatry, but nuclear science, you know. I mean, it's been a long and difficult attempt to disengage it. And I think what people are finding is that, you know, the invocation of science, capital S, as and reason and enlightenment, I don't think are going to make it easier for you to do that project. You know?
Do you think that what Nick and Alex are doing is even at all the same thing that what Nick Land is doing? Because to me they're pretty explicitly left, and at this point Nick Land has clearly gone a very different direction, but even the early Nick Land, I mean, he was pretty nihilist. I didn't get the sense that he was strongly left in any sense.
I mean, I met him once, so I can't. No significant conversation about anything at a conference years ago. But in our Thai book, you know, he talks about the anecdote about Schopenhauer lending his eyeglasses to someone to shoot down rioters. You know, I think whether it's flirtation, which I particularly think is a dubious thing that people then end up actually just becoming right-wing, you know, there's a kind of strong continuity with a certain tenor of, you know, that kind of thinking, whether it's reactionary as it is explicitly, it seems now, or, you know, hard-edged realism, this kind of, you know, machismo of engaging with things to the max, to the extreme, has always been a constant. And I think in some of the CCRU texts and those statements, you know, at least being British, you know, I don't say it gives me massive privilege, but they don't seem particularly left-wing, no. You know.
But with like Nick and Alex, though.
Yeah, but when it comes to Nick and Alex, I guess.
Yeah.
You know, they still seem to want a lot Nick Land in there. You know, there's something strange. That's what I'm saying about the use of the word accelerationism, the positioning of the project. It's a kind of, it's a need for it. You know, the need for some Nick Land. You know, it's why is that needed? If this is totally different, why have this reference to him? And my, you know, like I was sort of vaguely suggesting in the talk, is because I think it's a particular reading of radical immanence.
Benjamin, about the radical.
Sorry, Ivan. I asked Laura to join because her paper kind of like is trying to deal with some of the stuff. So I'm hoping. Laura, you know what we did, like, we also forgot to introduce you guys. So when you first speak, maybe, oh, John is joining us. Hello. John Bova is the newest member of the new center. He just joined the new center and using his membership, I thought that maybe it's a good idea to sort of like invite him to the room since we have like a foreign guest from England. Yeah, so Laura, maybe you want to introduce yourself before you ask your question or comment. We should have done that with everybody, but next time you're on, please introduce yourself to Benjamin. Go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me? Sorry, there's some noise outside. First of all, my name is Laura Lotti. I'm doing my PhD in Arts and Media in Sydney, and I have a background in economics, quantitative economics for 5 years, and then kind of accidentally stepped into philosophy when I did my master in Goldsmiths, which was a great, really great experience. But I think, I don't know, perhaps these, 5 years in economics really gave me a kind of, I don't know, a certain perspective on things that has perhaps been reinforced by kind of this belief and this illusionment with all the post-structuralist tradition that the accelerationist movement is I guess coming from. So yeah, I guess I really wanted to thank Benjamin for articulating much better than what I did, for instance, in that essay. What are my concerns, for instance, with accelerationism, especially this need of like finding new trajectories, perhaps new ways of looking at the same thing, because what the accelerationist movement, I think, does really well is individuating the problem. Then, I don't know, answering to that by looking at kind of like short-lived traditions, like short-lived, I guess, yeah, movement, like the early accelerationist post-structuralist movement and the CCRU. They're all amazing attempts, I think, to answer this problem. Although, perhaps, yeah, there is a need of like new trajectories, new terms, perhaps. Perhaps there's, I don't know. I'm trying to do away with the word capitalism, perhaps, as Manuel de Landa suggested long time ago, and instead looking at capitalism as an anti-market, focusing on markets as a techno-cultural milieu, perhaps, assemblage constituted by concrete technologies. So I don't know, by looking at algorithms, at algorithmic technology as a very concrete technology, perhaps we can, I don't know, perhaps it becomes easier, it becomes a closer thing rather than the abstraction of capital. And then this, on the other side, I don't know, looking at the aesthetics of power that these concrete technologies create, because we interface with them, right? So I think, I don't know, because I'm focusing as well, like on economic technologies, economic media. I'm at the moment I'm looking at, for instance, I'm looking at money. I'm looking at what the evolution of money as a technology as created. So the big change that fiat currency introduced, this idea actually, I think, of like flows of capital in a way. So so yeah, I don't know. I'm just I'm kind of struggling as well, I guess, with this idea of accelerationism, in the sense that it is, again, it's something that we need, perhaps, like today, especially in this particular historical moment. Although, again, I'm kind of like struggling with the premises, with the philosophical trajectory it departs from. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I don't really have any, I guess, question,
you know,
in this regard.
The question of science is important, because if you look, like, especially with the new rationalism, that's kind of like new rationalism acceleration that comes out of speculative realism. You look at Reza Negarestani. He's a person with an engineering background and obsessed with functionalism and function. You look at Ray Brazier. he's interested in sellers and random. So really, it's like debating like science and like talking about the separation between the actual material science, which is sort of like implicated in a power knowledge much more than the idea of science. And I mean, Benjamin, if you really think that all of science has been already subsumed, then why are we at the universities? Or why are we even having hopes in the university system? Why are we having hope in knowledge? If everything is subsumed, including science and knowledge, by capital, then what are we doing?
Well, because I don't think capitalism is a social form that works that way. I mean, I think because we are all subject to subsumption doesn't mean that that's complete absorption of us like zombie slaves. You know, I mean, I think what it is a contradictory relation of subsumption. It's a social relation. So, I've said a few times to people, I think there's a tension between it's the model of capitalism as completely subsuming everyone that then leads to the fantasy of an outside escape. So you end up with this model of capitalism as just a kind of thing that clings on and can be thrown away and then it's fine. Whereas, you know, capitalism is also elements of built infrastructure, social forms. You know, it's quite hard to tease out and tear out from it those things, and those contradictory tensions doesn't mean it's impossible to get out. But I'm quite sort of dully Marxist, if you like, in finding it you know, difficult to see how some of those forms of retooling will work to contest what is a social relation that extracts value from, you know, innovation and technology. I'm not saying all science is capitalist, you know, or all knowledge is capitalist, but it's all potentially available to being used by capital as a form of value generation. You know, that's the problem, isn't it? You know, that's what we face. We're not, you know, as I'm saying about antibiotics, they're great, but they're obviously being used to extract huge amounts of value, and, you know, charging people fortunes for them, not distributing them to people who need them. You know, I mean, that's the form of a capitalist social relation. Racism and other state power, but, you know, for non-freely available retrovirals, you know, the list can go on. Different form, you know, nuclear power, you know, an interesting kind of question, you know, how that functions. You know, even if we have a revolution, how are we going to deal with the kind of infrastructural legacy of, you know, radioactive waste that lasts 50,000 years? I'm not saying we're going to get rid of, you know, I think it's the tension and the contradictions of these forms. That,
also, my question from you.
Could you say just a little bit about why the negative is so important to you? And I'm kind of wondering, especially in relation to Paul Virilio, because I know you've worked on Virilio's work to some extent, or to a large extent. And so I'm just thinking of, because one thing that he says that he's not against technology, he's not against speed or acceleration or anything like that. He just thinks that, you know, we need to get inside the machine of research and development, and to really rethink how technology develop, how certain plans develop, and create better plans, basically. And the way that he gets there is through like a just very persistent critique of everything that exists in the current technological and political landscape. And so I'm just wondering if how you react to that. But because to me, what I get out of that is that there is actually a certain affirmation coming out of that. You know, he calls himself an art critic of technology, so he wants technology, he just wants better technology. And I'm wondering kind of how you see accelerationism. I've heard you use this phrase, selective accelerationism, a few times, and that makes me think that there is obviously a negative and a strongly critical dimension to your work, but that maybe there's also some affirmative dimension too. And I'm wondering if you could maybe speak to that, if there is.
Yeah, I mean, I think I probably didn't write a very clear book. You know, the conclusion of the book on the negative tries to talk about, you know, you can't have the negative on its own. That's just a philosophically nonsense, you know, because it has to always be in relation. And in fact, that's what interests me about the negative, is it's a relational concept. So my skepticism about some of what I call the affirmationists is this always this desire to separate a force that will be intrinsic to itself and not have this relation, whereas I'm kind of quite interested in going back. Everyone says the problem with the negative, it's always tied to what it's negating, it's always tied to what it's critiquing, and that's a bad thing. I actually think that's an interesting thing, because it means that it is kind of engaged with the contradictions and tensions of what it's trying to undo. So part of my attempt to rethink the negative is to get away from grand concepts of capital N negativity, which turn out to be synonymous with capital A affirmation. Something totally negative is something totally positive if you look at the way someone
Benjamin, that negativity actually is very much continued in Nick Land's work, and it has to do with removing sort of the last theological remnants to a lot of philosophical thought. So it has that real sense of negativity. That's what I like as well. Even Brazier's stuff and Reza's stuff, removing those last vestiges of theological thoughts, which is present in Heidegger and vitalism. So I'm interested in your current work on the critiques currently of vitalism, because if you do have that radical negativity, that should also apply to theology. And then what are you left with as the concept of the human? And that then really is a starting point for, transhumanism, Prometheanism.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things I think I would say, at least, Nick's book on Bataille, I wrote a thesis on Bataille, so I had my time criticising it.
Yeah.
You do when you write theses. But, I find that Nick's conception of negativity in that book is too substantialist, it's too tied to an exteriority, it's Schopenhauerian, it's a kind of grand outside of negativity that washes over something positive. So what I'm saying to you is, although I'm sure I haven't got it worked out, I'm interested in the intertwining of the negative with what it's negating, not a kind of grand outside negativity. So that's that point. In terms of the anti-theological, that's my critique of vitalism, which is a book that I've not finished because I was writing this one and doing other things, is that it's a critique of theological residues that come up in vitalism because of this transformation of life into a great affirmative power, which I see as a sort of fundamentally Christological kind of dynamic, between Christ as fallen and risen, crucified and then bare life and then transformed into a subject of power. So, my critique of vitalism is this theological element, plus that this is a kind of theology of capital. The theology of capitalism is this faith that there's always something outside to generate value. What Marx says is, he says the bourgeoisie, I was using this quote for something else today, the bourgeoisie has great reason to believe in the supernatural creative power of labour, because that's where value comes from for a capitalist society. It's the one that believes in humans. Capitalism is correlationist.
Yeah.
Capitalism is a humanism that only sees value as generated by human beings in their labour. So, that's why I'm interested in kind of connecting, I guess, these sort of elements of critique.
So you're actually quite accelerationist, to an extent.
No, I don't think so. I don't think being anti-theological or anti-vitalist is to be accelerationist, per se, because I think what they end up doing with their kind of inhumanism, not so much Ray or Reza, but in the Landian sense, is generating a kind of new, you can end up with the dark vitalism, the zombie vitalism, the vitalism of inhumanity, still is this kind of belief in an excessive productive force. So I think there's a kind of continuity between some of the couching of accelerationism and its belief in forces and substance with vitalism. So,
because you continue to mention antibiotics as an example, what about something which would radically alter the idea of the human also?
But Ben, let me just go back to the question of cybernetics, because I think by focusing on cybernetics, and sorry, this is my research and my interest, that a lot of the things that seems to be new, seems to be not new, seems to not be new, because we've heard this all before. There's nothing new about that. Find a new context to be reiterated in a new way because of the question of the machine. Now, I completely agree with your sort of characterization of the Landian like he basically advocates a form of machinic vitalism. I completely agree with that. But at the same time, we cannot keep thinking of the world prior to machine and neglect the significance of the machine as much as we have to. Like, so basically these questions of science, these questions of epistemology, these questions of manifest image and scientific image, however you want to put it, the Salarzian categories, become pertinent because of what we see as, you know, I just finished finally reading completely through all the notes and stuff Chatelet's To Think and Live Like Pigs, which Robin McKay has translated and is coming out soon by Urbanomic, right? And this crazy amalgamation of state, capital, and cybernetics into almost what he called tertiary state, right? And so there's this geopolitical economy, global geopolitical economy, twice global, because geo is already global. This global geopolitical economic problem called what he called the tertiary state, which is the amalgamation of state, capital, and cybernetic. It is what makes all this stuff that to some of us, to our ears, sound, oh, I've already heard it before, kind of like important to repose, the return to a new form of, updated form of enlightenment, and sort of like think about what is significant about the machine. Okay, it's not vital, it's not source of like labor or like source of like perpetual source of life, the way land wants to like rely on them. But I mean, what are we going to do with the machine?
Yeah, I don't think that's the question which sat in front of one. You know, I mean, that's a question I think is, you know, it's something to be thought as it is. You know, I mean, you know, I suppose I'm just saying that when I think about critiques of technology or works or analyses of science, you know, I mean, the accelerationist work still seems to me very early doors and not developed. And I think of, you know, I mean, I'm pretty anti-Latour, but, you know, I think of the stuff I've read in science studies and, you know, the other work that I've seen done. I don't have, you know, a global answer to what we do with the machine, but what I suppose I'm saying is that in part, you know, it's not just, you know, again, the abstract, the machine, it's also what you're talking about is the structure, the built environment, the way it's engaged with, the way machines have become, you know, not subsumed but engaged with processes of value formation. And before we get on to, like was raised earlier, you know, places in the world where, you know, there's a quite interesting book, Shock of the Old, you know, about how loads of quote-unquote old technologies are quite important for large amounts of the world, you know, so bicycles being, you know, one of the famous examples. So, you know, I think I just haven't seen what Ray's work and Rez's work except by saying, which I agree with, you know, we need to think about reason, and, you know, I mean, who's saying, we seem to know some people who are, but, you know, who's totally irrationalist? You know, I don't see that as like a problem, saying we need to think about science, we need to think about reason, we need to think about, I'm a bit unhappy with the word enlightenment, just because of Nick's dark enlightenment, and as I said to Nick Cernicek, you know, you might want to distinguish this word from the, to be rude, the tossers who use it, you know, from Land's dark enlightenment to those kind of new atheists. So, you know, there's some work to be done in distinguishing what exactly that is, but, you know, that's a philosophical project. It's not, you know, my project, but people doing work on cybernetics or science, I think, is necessary. You know, I think it was raised earlier, you know, I'm a bit skeptical about the kind of sci-fi level opposing certain other things, as, you know, there are emerging technologies that will primarily be, as most new technologies are, for the rich. You know, there are technologies of transformation that are coming or arriving, and I still think they're pretty worth subjecting to pretty standard critiques, not just quote-unquote being a humanist, but just like, you know, who gets access to these things, why is vast amounts of money being spent on solving, you know, particular tiny problems that affect tiny proportion of the world's population, etc. So I still have some
Can I make a question?
Science, because I think it's worth doing.
two people haven't spoken. One is Morgan, and the other one is John, who joined us. I don't know if Morgan, would you like to join the conversation, or because I don't know for how long more we're gonna have Benjamin. He must be tired too. So, but it would be good if we hear from the two people who haven't spoken as well.
Thanks for inviting me, but I don't really have any comments.
No? Okay.
Thanks.
John, what about you?
For now, just listening. Thank you.
Okay, so I just wanted to make sure. Where do everyone feels like going from here?
Yeah, it's Shakali.
I just wanted to raise one point with Benjamin. It's a question, like you mentioned, there's not really much new, and I agree. I'm deeply suspicious of anything which posits itself as radically new, because there's a conversation for history to be had, and I would agree that there isn't a lot that's really new, but that's a good thing. It's a recovery from sort of a postmodern and a neoliberal determinacy, and perhaps even some sort of fetish with irrationalism. And that's why it's good that it's a return to, those good old time religious values of the Enlightenment. Not religious, but in that sense, yes, it's good that it's not coming as some American liberal, yeah, this is new, this disrupts everything that you've ever thought about reality. It's like, no, power structures exist, typical Marxist historical materialism exists, and all the rest. So,
yeah, I mean, I think it's, they're engaging with those questions, but like, I'm kind of repeating myself at this point, but, I just still think that some of the ways those problems are posed, by what I've read of the existing material, is still, I find, problematic. And it's, there is still a claim to newness, and I understand that as a polemical technique, polemic and galvanizing people and getting debate and becoming, spreading your ideas involves, these things. It's that's perfectly understandable. So I'm not. What I guess is I'm concerned is what gets missed out of those drives seems to me to quite a lot of work that's already been done, and not just because it's bad to ignore other people's work, although personally I think it is, because I'm a boring academic who likes footnotes, but it's also bad because I think it ignores some of the tensions and problems that those projects ran into. That
I agree.
So that's, it's not just be historical for the sake of it.
Yeah.
Can I ask a very quick question, Benjamin?
Ways that, sorry.
And I guess this is for everyone. And I don't know if you address this in your book. I wonder if Alex and Nick's position and others who, colloquially and serial-comically we call nice accelerationists, is part of the project, in your estimation, a reaction to Nick Land's sort of radically cynical, hyper-nihilist position? I mean, he is kind of the fanged noumena, and there's a certain, no pun intended, certain teeth and violence inherent in his work. And I'm wondering if you see some of the left accelerationists, for lack of a better word, as engaging what they see as the need to restrain the dystopian elements in his project. And if you address this in your book, you make some mention to it in your paper, and I'm looking through my notes and I can't seem to find it.
Yeah, I don't know if I do, but I mean, I think what I would say is that there's a critique of Land, basically the speed thing, that he's just endorsing capitalism, which is probably right. But I think there is a problem, is that there is this sort of desire or inhabiting of the anti-humanism. I mean, I've never been a big fan of Nick Land's writing style, so I find it hard to find it attractive, but people do. So I think there is, in the left accelerationism, there's still a kind of Landian influence. It comes out more in a kind of what I would call like a hard-edged geopolitical realism. It's this kind of, and some of the inhumanism. So I don't see it as solely anti-Nick Land coming against his project, trying to, critique him. I see there's a sort of element of continuity in terms of trying to continue that project, not the Dark Enlightenment stuff, but continue the earlier CCRU project and redirect it. And I think in doing that, they take on, for what for me have always been some of the vices of that project. So, you know, there's a continuity about, you know, the interest in UK dance music, which I'm interested in, and other things. So there are elements of agreement, and also, like I said before, you know, I think the project, I sometimes joke it's like a postmodern Saint-Simonism. You know, there's a kind of tendency for it to be giving the orders in a particular way, setting structures of organisation that are very unspecific about what is actually going to happen on the ground or as a political project. And like I said, I'm not a believer in kind of mass spontaneity, although I'm a believer in people can decide their own fates for themselves at times, and people aren't stupid. And I think there's a sort of danger of a kind of techno-scientific hegemonic substitutionism in the way some of the elements of the manifesto talk. You know, there's the accelerationist, and then there's the benighted others who need to be told. And I personally have never particularly liked that kind of political way of doing things, because I think I never see myself as the one giving the orders. I see myself as the one being ordered around. So, you know, I think there's a kind of inhumanism. It was like in Land. You know, Land was totally against for the demolition of the human, and there was a cult of personality about Nick Land. You know, the cult of non-personality. So, you know, you can have an inhumanism, you know, destroy the humanity, dissolve everything, except don't dissolve me. You know, worship me as the placeholder of the inhuman. And I think within the accelerationist project, it's nowhere near like as extreme as Land's, but I still think within all this sort of taking apart, destroying, retooling, you know, there's questions of who is doing it and what is happening there get sort of pushed aside, and I think that is the sort of Landian legacy in the new accelerationism that I think they need to more clearly address. You know, why do
Benjamin, that's an excellent point. Yeah, I agree with. I would like to marry actually Ron Sierre's idea of radical pedagogy and radical equality of intellectual capacity to accelerationism, to avoid it becoming too much a horizontal. We're the techno-scientific intellectual class, and we will, you know, that's in fact a problem that was in the party politics of Italy. I know a lot, which really turned off my generation from, you know, the Communist Party. That sort of horizontalism, which I understand Piketty even is aversion to, you know, to communism, because I voted Berlusconi in '94 as an 18-year-old merely because party politics and its hierarchical structure had just completely, and Marxist orthodoxy had just completely turned a whole generation off politics. So
yeah, and there's in the UK, my parents, we come from Essex, which is sort of seen as the birthplace of Thatcherism. I think they voted Conservative because Thatcher's promise to the working class was you don't have to be working class anymore. We're going to give you a house, then you're going to be able to borrow money, and that, you know, that's in a way that was one of the failures of social democracy, which is kind of comes back to the communizing point. They want the working class to stay in the working class position. So that sort of Thatcherism always had this energizing effect in the UK amongst some, or this promise of an escape from a stable position. You know, Britain, I don't know, it seems from all your positions, but often, you know, is seen as a very sort of static, hierarchical, class-bound society. So Thatcherism was a kind of, you know, I hated it, but not on these grounds, but had this appeal. And I think the Landian CCRU stuff is, you know, the British accelerationists, you know, it's buying into this demolish the old society. You know, there's a famous book right about Britain on living in an old country, and I'm just sort of interested just in a paper on the geographies of accelerationism. And I think there's a lot to be said about the kind of national and the particular and specific place it comes from. Because although it's always talking about the global, you know, the geopolitical, the world, which I think is right. Like was said right at the start, capitalism is a global social form. Resistance to it is going to have to be on a global scale, otherwise you're dead. Then what gets missed in that, I think, is also these kind of questions of national, political tradition, and what kind of representations of acceleration, what kinds of representations of hegemony politics have been tried. So again, I think it's kind of interesting to me, at least, to kind of think about where these ideas are being articulated from, and what kinds of local traditions, folk politics, but the folk politics of the reaction against folk politics.
Yeah, and I agree with you completely, and I like it the way accelerationism has deconstructed the nostalgic view as something posited by capital with Mark Fisher's piece Avatar, and you do a really interesting thing in your paper on African futurism where you kind of deconstruct then the anti-nostalgic accelerationist view as coming itself from neoliberal, which I think is important, very important as well. But it's interesting though, we need to understand why back then when Thatcher came out, why capital was so alluring to the working classes, why people voted against their own long-term interests. I think that's really key in like Lyotard's polemical work, is what's the appeal of it, even if we all agree it ultimately is detrimental and it only serves the interest of the 1%. How come, however, it continues to libidinally appeal to people, and how to counter that without just a moral negative critique of you don't know, but you're just rather than the Marxist critique of if we teach them the knowledge of their own status of exploitation, they'll rise up, and instead no, they keep buying more gadgets.
I mean, you should ask that question from Sachs, who developed the campaign for Thatcher, because it had a lot to do with the utilization of communicational media by the Thatcher campaign, as much as it had to do with basically the option of romanticizing a negative class struggle by the working class was communicational technologies of the time, and the way they were utilized for Thatcher campaign allowed the working class to even be exposed to the idea, then to actually give it a chance. So it wasn't sort of we always have to remember that like Stiegler, because Stiegler goes into detail about this, right? Like for Stiegler, the California ideology comes of Ayn Rand. So then neoliberalism in the late 70s have to do with the development of microprocessor and computer, directly and indirectly. So you see, for me, the question of technology and the machine is always there. Thatcherism was sort of computers were implicated, technology was implicated in it, in more than one way. One way.
There's also, boring, but there's also a kind of history. The previous Labour government to 1979 had introduced austerity measures. It introduced IMF austerity measures under the, so strangely enough, the working class weren't that happy. There was a general strike, and then Thatcher was elected on a very small majority. It wasn't a massive landslide. The danger, I agree with you, we need to look at communications and technology, but I think there's a danger that we get into sort of overstating the libidinal appeal of right-wing ideas or capitalism, where often, in the UK at the moment, very small numbers, it's the lack of appeal that's probably electing people. The small numbers of people are voting. Voting is dominated by the elderly. All major parties are committed to protecting pensions, because that's basically buying your voters. If you touch them, you're in trouble. Yeah. So there are kind of, very, if you like, unsexy.
But your point, Simon. Your point, Simon, also is about how social democracy maybe had already given up on social democracy itself prior to Thatcher, and you see that in the fall of communism. Who basically sold off all the assets of the Eastern European governments and Russia were ex-communists who had given up on the state ideology already to be able to be at a stage to integrate with such high speed into sort of Western capitalism, a long-standing tradition of state capitalism or whatever, Marxism or whatever you want to, Marxist-Leninism, whatever you want to call the Eastern Eastern Bloc. So yeah, so social democracy itself was starting to have doubts about their own turf.
Yeah, I mean, Cunningham said something interesting in the London thing, and I think he's going to write something. I mean, he's critical of accelerationism, but what I thought he said was interesting is that we're all really discussing about socialism. You know, the whole thing about the idea of communism, which was on conferences, whereas really accelerationism and what I'm doing is a critique of it. You know, there is a kind of focus on social democracy, socialism, the kind of actually existing, and I think there is, which I'm still thinking about it, and I'm trying to think about it some more for New York. But you know, I think there's something. You know, Nick and Alex's are appeals to Chile, to Russian experiments in the 50s. Not so much to, which I think is interesting, to other European experiments. You know, the Swedish model, which everyone was interested in. But you know, I think it's an interesting thing that there is a kind of perhaps another hidden commonality of a debate about socialism and a desire for, you know, not the idea of communism but the practice of socialism that's going on within the discussions around accelerationism, you know, which I think is a kind of one of the threads that's kind of run through what we've been talking about tonight. But on that note, I am going to have to apologise and go to bed. It's,
well, thank you so much for your time.
No, that's okay. It's my pleasure. Thank you all for being
Thank you very much, Benjamin.
Thank you. I'll just have to work out how to switch the technology off now.
Yes.
Goodbye.
Thanks so much, Benjamin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, how was it, everyone? I think it was really good.
Yeah, it was really good. Absolutely agree.
And his criticisms of acceleration are also sharpening too. I think it like this engagement is like it's very productive for him also as well as for Nick and Alex and whoever's involved with that project. Great. This is not the Benjamin Noys of a year and a half ago when the manifesto came out.
Mm-hmm.
So, Jason, do you want to like talk about the rest of the class, the program?
Yeah. So
we have about an hour and a half left, right? To sort of like go over the material and maybe some of the.
We started pretty much on time, so we technically have about 1 hour, but we can always go over. Obviously.
No, but if you remember, we saved half an hour last time for today.
Oh, right. Okay. So in the last hour and a half, we're going to go over the readings for today, which was Energy and Capitalism and an excerpt from Libidinal Economy. I think the way that we'll approach it is we'll start out with student presentations, and then we'll, Mo and I will kind of give feedback on that, and we'll have kind of an exchange based on that, based on those. And so we'll start off with the student presentations, student presenting. Mo and I will respond to those, and
Tony's going to present too, right? Because Tony was supposed to present on libidinal economy.
I believe so. Yeah, I'm not totally sure about that.
But I think Tony said that he prefers to do it like after the students. So let's start with Carlos, because Carlos left a note here saying like he would like to leave at 9 o'clock. So then we do Carlos, and then Laura, are you okay with that? For Carlos to go first, and then we'll go over yours, and then we'll do the rest. Okay. So Carlos, go ahead.
Oh, wow! I didn't even prepare a Google Doc or anything. But I will. I was looking at my notes. Actually, as an auditor, I was sort of committed to the sort of informal model of this. But Laura, do you have something formal presented, like, or were you gonna do the dialogue? Because if you have something formal, I can actually extend my time a little.
Not really. I've got notes on the text more than anything.
It's totally fine. Just
okay. All right. Then I'll get started with my decelerationist technology here. And so we're talking about Energumen Capitalism by Jean-François Lyotard. Thank you to whoever found it in the semiotext version online. This was first published, and I'm going to assume that most people are relatively familiar with Lyotard's pedigree. Born in the 20s, so much of the generation. Dies in 1998 from symptoms of leukemia. He emerges in the 60s after finishing his dissertation in 63, if I'm not mistaken, as part of the Socialisme au Barbarie contingent with Castoriadis and a number of other thinkers. And this text, Energumen Capitalism, is first published in 1973, at least in book form, in a text called Le dispositif pulsionnel, the driving, the devices of the theory of the drive in English, for a sort of inelegant translation. And the interesting thing here is that the text, I'm going to start with this, the title as a sort of point of departure, and then get into some of the basic arguments. The energumen is, I imagine many people looked it up. The energumen is two things. The first one, it's a being possessed by a demon. It's not a eudaimon, to use the Socratic notion, but it's a diabolical figure, right? It's this devil figure. And then the second one is that in French and in Spanish, I can speak for Spanish, to some degree Portuguese, it's a furious being, and also a being of a kind of furiousness and insanity that makes them marginal. So I was looking in the text for that, and I thought it would be interesting at some point to explore that sort of text, that sort of aspect of the text, because he really doesn't discuss it in the context of the translation that Robin provides us. So just beginning sort of not even page by page, but just the text sections in the Accelerationist reader. And I think that the critical questions, I can go from, let's start with page 167. One of the things that Lyotard points out is that, okay, modernity has created there's no phenomenal numinal division anymore. The question is that capital has created this collapse. Modernity has only production and perpetual dislocation. How do I take him talking about perpetual dislocation? Perpetual dislocation isn't just the dislocation of subjects, but rather the dislocation of sites for capital, right? Capital has the ability to infiltrate every site, and it spreads itself not uniformly, but rather totally across all sorts of different fields of life. And this is where he uses the pantograph. And the pantograph is this delivery system for electrical energy. So he's modeling, after Deleuze and Guattari, capital's totality as a kind of field of flows. Now remember, and I forgot to say this is effectively a kind of book review of the Anti-Oedipus. Right? This is him working through the problems of the Anti-Oedipus to end up at a solution for some of the problems the text itself points at, and he'll work through Lyotard at the end. If you guys have questions, you can ask me. If you think that I'm misreading it, go ahead, and I can work off that. But I'm going to talk about the first section and then continue. So Lyotard puts on this idea that what he's arguing is that he, Deleuze, Guattari, and Baudrillard to a certain degree are not positing what he calls a critique of capital, but rather these are positive positional books. And why does he make this distinction? Because for him, critique takes the object of critique as its own object. In other words, it creates a kind of model for the object, and then it moves solely within this object. But what he's saying is this actually maps flows of escape. flows of reading and energy. So he sees this, I think, as a much simpler project. And this is on page 169. I'll just look at this quote very quickly. As he says, so critique makes itself
Sorry, are you reading from the semiotext copy or from the reader?
Yeah, so I can also go ahead and do it by paragraphs. I'm sort of a...
No, that's good. If you just give us the page of the reader, because I also have the reader. I'm very selfish. I just want to like find out for myself.
Oh, super. Yeah, 160, pardon me, begins at the last paragraph of 168 after a dash that says, so critique makes itself the object of the object, right?
Yes.
And then he says, I'm going to skip over the part of Bataille. He says, because one either gets out immediately without wasting time critiquing, simply because one is elsewhere than the enemy's domain, or else one's critique, keeping one foot inside while stepping outside with the other. Positivity of the negative, but in fact the nothingness of this positivity. Next paragraph, he says, what is important here is not negativity, but its positioning, the way the problem is posed. So for Lyotard, this book is critical, is that it does not take itself as the object of its critique. It's not working out a system the way that I read it in quite the same way that Marxism is doing, but rather it's allowing itself to be positioned within the critique by the forces of capital. So this is how I read the energumen. And I haven't found it, and maybe I just totally missed in the reading, but this is where I think he's talking about the possession of capital. This is the energumen moment. And so we can just go on.
You know that is echoed also in the libidinal economy, right? Because there he talks about on page 213, he talks about how many the same coming and goings in the factory, how many pennies per hour, how many tons of coal, how many cast iron bars, how many barrels of shit, not produced, of course, but endured. So he abandons these activities almost as production, but sort of like, but look at them from the side of the active human who actively wants to do this kind of stuff, who decides to sort of like endure these activities.
Yeah, I think that's a very nice emendation to what I'm saying. So really, I'm just taking this text for us as a group, as a class, to be a kind of remapping of some of the essential arguments of the anti-Oedipus, but with a twist. And the twist is this move towards a kind of, the way I'm reading it, sort of total horizontalization of capital so that we can see it across this field. And I'm going to continue in what I articulate just my key quotes quickly. So on 170 at the bottom, he talks about the anti-Oedipus, the essential figure. He says, thus we reaffirm what the book affirms. We show how it is one of the most intense products of the new libidinal figure that is beginning to gel inside of capitalism. And so what he's beginning to suggest is that this is an imminent critique, right? So there's this move to imminence, and this is, something that I think is part of the accelerationist. This is my assessment. Part of the accelerationist movement is to see itself as much more imminently situated than other form of critical modes because of the way that capitalism flows through the critiques. So he goes on into the next page to make sure that by suggesting that capital and state capitalism, to use the old British version of Stalinism, and sort of what we call today neoliberal capitalism, are both essentially epiphenomenon of capital. On the one hand, you have what he calls the despotic control model. So anything that is libidinally constructed. And what does that mean? That means that our pleasures, our accesses, our ins and outs to our body our intersubjective relationships, our education, everything, every sort of access that we have in just to make us human. This is either configured in a despotic arrangement or capital. And capital's arrangement is solely determined by what he says is the auspices of profit and exchange value. Says it on page 173, says, capital is this mapping. It must only happen under the auspices of profit in what Deleuze and Guattari call the surplus value code, that is, a gain of prestige, which presupposes an emotional attachment. Capitalism offers nothing to believe in. Cynicism is its morality. The party, on the contrary, as a despotic configuration, requires a mapping that is territorialized, coded, and hierarchized in the religious sense of the term. So he goes on in several pages to say basically that there's no real dialectical difference between capital and the Soviet model, for lack of a better term, or the communist model, the Marxist model. And he has a whole list of examples on page 174 about this. What instead he says is that capital is this overflowing force. This is on 174. And we've all seen this before. We've all seen this before. The nuance in this doesn't really come until page 177, until 177 at the top, where he starts talking about the category of the limit, the catastrophe. What he's basically suggesting is that read capital, I'll give you the quote, reappearance of the category of the limit, the catastrophe, response of the capitalists and entrepreneurs. Instead, incorporate the cost of depollution into the production costs. This example where he's talking about depollution and production costs, where capitalism must maintain growth over everything, it's just his way of, in my reading, of basically saying the system is always perpetuating itself on around this cycle. In a sense, this is an incredibly repetitive text that uses a sort of Freudian remapping in certain ways of Deleuze and Guattari's texts in order to come at them and basically say, you're right. In my ways, there's a kind of fundamental agreement that he has here. And we can go on and I can present a more, I don't want to bore anybody.
No, but you're not. Go ahead.
Oh, okay, cool.
What do you think is the role of when he says that cynicism is the morality of capitalism?
I think what I'm getting. Thank you, Jason. That's a really good question. Sorry, it's like today was meeting day, so my brain is a little fried.
No, this is great.
Okay, so the meta. I'll get to the meta question after I answer your question. So basically, cynicism is in. Let me find the quote because I'm good. Okay. Whereas you have the despotic mode, which is sort of the old Soviet model, right? We're talking about the 70s with Stalin or whatever sort of model of an authoritarian regime that guarantees this libidinal investment. Capitalism lacks that. It may have epiphenomenal moments where its libidinal investment coalesces around a figure, right? So you'll have Thatcher was Benjamin's example, or Reagan. You know, we're North American, so we may remember Reagan, or even a kind of sort of religiously strange figure, if you want to talk about other revolutions. Maybe the Iran Revolution is a bad example of this, but it's the first one that comes to my mind. Capitalism cynicism is that it does not require anything, any metafigure to construct its libidinal organization, because its fundamental axiom is exchange value. So really, cynicism is just an absolute, in my reading, an absolute horizontalization of perspective. This is why we're never outside of capital. It's not because capital, the way that I read is because capital has extended itself to all the different corners of the world, but rather once you're in, everything is itself determined by these axioms. And that's why despotism in the traditional sort of state socialist sense is kind of banal as well, because it's always guaranteed by the structure of the party or of the state or of the supreme phenomenon of the state or the leader. So that's my question to that. You know, the thing that I put on mine is pretty bad. Here's my chicken scratch, which nobody can read, not even Jason. Is how do we, if anyone, and I wanted to pose this question, how do we accelerate, and do we accelerate? At the end of his text, what Lyotard basically proposes is not acceleration, but one small quote where he says, and this is a couple of small quotes, but the main one where it begins is, here we go. There we go. 191. He begins to say this. So, we must evacuate the whole nostalgic mode of speaking and seeing. It exits via the holes in Guattari rip open in Western discourse. The territorial machine of savagery, or even the great despotic machine of barbarianism, are not, as Nietzsche sometimes dreamed, a good perspective from which to look at the capitalist machinery. Following Marx, Deleuze and Guattari say the opposite. That capitalist perspective from which to look at everything. If you look at capitalism through castration, it goes on and on and on, but he puts it right there. The strength of capitalism, and here's the last quote on 192, bottom paragraph. He says, the strength of capitalism lies in its beginning to unravel itself from the function of the ambivalence between the subject, the libidinal subject, and the Barthes subject. It breaks down. Revolution is not the return to the great castrator and the little castratees, which is the best translation of a word I've ever heard, a definitive reactionary view, but their dissolution in an economy without end or law. So this is where I think the crux of the Accelerationist project comes in, is, you know, that revolution isn't something that's going to be created from another kind of libidinal investment, from another site of desire, but rather through the kind of perpetual repetition and dissolution of any sort of libidinal myth, of any sort of great, you know, possibility effect. So in a sense, it's deeply, deeply nihilist, but much more so and much more nuanced than I think we can, we might even see ourselves.
What about this? I don't know. A lot of people hate this idea, but I personally love obsessing over titles that people choose. That's just me. But energumen, what do you think is what is unique to an energumen capitalism? I mean, this doesn't have to be just you. This can be. I don't want you to feel like it's, you know, like you're on the spot. So other people can answer if you want, but I think this is a really interesting part of it, because it seems to me like this concept of energumen is, it kind of leads to it kind of like frames how Lyotard thinks that capitalism could be brought to an end, even though it is kind of nihilistic. But he does have a few places where he suggests how it might come to an end.
Yeah, he does have that. I don't know. I'll open it up, but I have some provisional thoughts on the matter.
Okay.
I mean, I figured I see this as really as a not just a course, but as a series of workshops where everyone can intervene. So please, I mean, I'm not really trying to get myself out. I'll talk.
Yeah.
You know,
be great. I just didn't want you to feel on the spot. That's it.
No. Does anyone have any addition to that concept of energumen, of the energumen or the energumen? I was very motivated by that particular, by that word. It's something that I've been very, very struggling with. Maybe not struggling with, but very influenced by, very inspired by shaken.
You know what? I want to go to page 177 and add a little anecdote or footnote here, which kind of like shows my sort of like connecting this to what I'm interested in and what I've been researching, which is sort of like halfway in that second part where it talks about energon and capital. He says, when Deleuze and Guattari write that capitalism must be thought according to the category of the bank rather than the production, right? Mm-hmm. It will be cried that this is Keynesian ideology, a techno-bureaucratic representation of the system by intellectual cutoff from the practice, and in abandoning the point of view of the production, right?
I mean,
One turns to the bank. But what I'm interested and fascinated with is how the idea that capitalism always was what do you call it? A category of the bank.
Oh, yeah.
It's only through a misrecognition first by neoclassical, like Adam Smith and those guys, Ricardo and Adam Smith, and then by Marx's affirmation of that epistemology, you start understanding capitalism as sort of like a result of industrial revolution and sort of like the acceleration of productive forces and all that. Whereas, and then my example of that are Nitzan and Bichler, who built their whole capital as power hypothesis on the fact that capitalism, and also people like Hariri kind of endorse that, right? That like capitalism as we know it, the practiced capitalism as we know it, is a form of selling of the future, is a form of banking, is a form of sort of like capitalization as the basis of capitalism, rather than so capitalism does not come from the dialectics between the productive forces and the relations of production, but it comes out of sort of like reconciling present and future.
Yeah. It's a retroactive logic. He talks about it in the, if you follow it to the next paragraph, he says it in this very, really subtle, I think, reading of Marx, where he talks about the critical universality is outlined as well, with the hypothesis that with indifference, with the effect of the principle of equivalence, that is decoding. You know, it's very typical Guattari to layer these different sort of operators under the one kind of axiomatic heading, right? So for him, the question of equivalence is itself an operator of decoding, right? You get equivalence and you begin to be able to proceed to create all these procedures. And he says in the next sentence, there are surfaces in the workers, or the capitalist practice of capitalism, the empty space in which the construction of the great categories of work and value, so there's your Smith right there, will become possible, along with the possibility of applying these categories retroactively to dispositifs, pre-capitalist forms, in which these modalities have been covered over by codes, by markings and representations that did not permit, a generalized political economy. That is, forms that kept political and libidinal economies apart from one another, with the latter diverted into religion, customs, and rituals of inscription, cruelty, and terror. With capitalism, all of this becomes equalizable, right? So in like Usual Suspects, right? With this blow, he effectively recreates a huge part of the history of Marxist of economic development. And as a Latin Americanist, this, I see the colonial period emerging, right, as this libidinal investment that is trying to reconcile the emergence of exchange and this transition to another world. So I think that's a really good point you're making.
Well, to me, what makes Nitzan and Bichler interesting is that they're willing to put forth a metric for it by introducing the concepts of hype and risk, which are both libidinal. But actually, in their model, especially through the understanding of the financial market and the way they work, you can actually quantify this libidinal aspect of the economy and see how this immanent economy, in which production and labor are part of and not like the base of everything, kind of like function.
Yeah, I agree.
What about the model of agency in here, though? Because I mean, basically, what he says is that the traditional Marxist model, in which I'll just give you a direct quote. He says, "Capitalism is never going to perish of a bad conscience. It will not expire through lack. It will not expire through a failure to give the exploited what they are owed. If it dies, it is through excess, because its energetics continually displace its limits. Restitution comes as an extra and not as a paranoiac passion to do justice, to give everyone their due, as if everyone knew what it was." So,
I disagree.
Sounds very accurate to me, but the part that I'm wondering about is agency. How do you in Lyotard's model? I mean, how do you push capitalism over the edge, or you kind of
you don't. Lyotard was. I don't think you do. Lyotard had the white flag up. Mm-hmm. This is all elaboration of the Lyotarian white flag, in my humble opinion.
But I don't entirely disagree. A couple things that Ivan had said about Rancière and radical pedagogy, and then the way that Benjamin reads the accelerationist program through Nick and Ray Brassier and Alex and others, and then this, and reading Kamat Châtelet. I think there's a much more, there's almost a kind of, for lack of a better term, francophone pessimism involved in there. There's a real radical nihilism that I'm not sure would actually be modeled in some of the later works. I think Negarestani is much more optimistic about our agency. I think that for writing,
you know where that comes from. This is the essay. I'm going to post it to the classroom, and it's the essay that Reza contributed to the speculative realism, ontology or whatever that Nick Cernicek put together. Right? If you remember that book, it's got like a tool on the cover, and Zizek's in it, and like
a speculative turn.
Yeah, a speculative turn. Thank you. And Reza in it kind of like rejects both Nick Land and this type of Lyotard vitalism of capital as a machine, and talks about capitalism as a sort of like a force that has its own sort of limits, because it's like a life form. It's like that famous Freudian quote about sort of like knowing that you're going to die and only making decisions to go forward as much as it does not put your entire life in danger. So and Reza finds the agency right there in the sort of like this conservative ambitions of capital, which is like the way life acts, like in a sort of like even biological way. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but I'll put the essay there.
I personally I don't disagree on it. Personally, to answer Jason's question, I think the only agency we have is a kind of hermeneutic agency, and that's maybe small. That's maybe a small consolation for the sort of the epic inclusion and pessimism that he has. But it's he talks about it. Let me find the quote right here, 207. Where he says, okay, Deleuze and Guattari's, he says there's a big long quote, where he talks about, here, I'm going to begin at the beginning. Here indeed is a depressed thought, here is a pious, nihilist thought. It is nihilist and pious because it is a thought. A thought is that in which the energetic position forgets itself in representing itself. So he's replicating his notion of critique in here, in other words, right? Critique taking the object of itself as the object of thought. Thought can always critique a thought, can always exhibit the theatricality of a thought, repeating the distancing. This is what he's saying. He says, what is important, this is in the middle of the paragraph, is not the discourse on metaphysics. That is the discourse on metaphysics. Metaphysics is the force of discourse potential in all discourse. What counts is that it changes the scene, the dramaturgy, the site, the modality of inscription, the filter, and thus the libidinal position. Thinkers think metaphysical theatricality, and yet the position of desire is displaced. Desire works, new machines start up, old ones stop working or idle for a moment or race and heat up. This transport of force does not belong to thought or to metaphysics. You come down and I'll get to the end. The Deleuze book represents this transport in discourse. If you understand only its representation, you have lost it. You would be right, you would have reason in the interior to, sorry, my daughter and my wife are funny people, and we have this window here, and they're being silly, so it's good to have a little break of that. Okay, let me start over. If you understand only its representation, you have lost it. You would be right, you would have reason, in italics, in the interior of this figure. But you will be forgotten. As everything is forgotten that is not forgetting, everything that is placed within the theater, the museum, the school. In the libidinal dispositif that is rising to be right, to have reason, that is, to place oneself in the museum, is not what is important. What is important is to be able to laugh and dance. And I mean, I'm not sure that they have agency. And it's a really big problem for me, especially as a Latin Americanist, when we have the left populisms, we have the Latin American pink tide, we have the Bolivian constitution, we have these struggles with increasing the output of, for lack of a better term, of agency across multiple communities, the human, the non-human, that have never had a kind of access to agency because of colonialism and other figures. So it's a big issue for me. I don't. That's where I see agency breaking down, and Kamat is pretty clear about that, and Châtelet too. Châtelet is just a bit more bitter.
Okay.
So that's hopefully that's an answer. I'd love to hear somebody else.
So let's see if other people would like to chime in and say stuff about the presentation. Especially like Tony, you can, because you're gonna also be. No, actually, no. Sorry, never mind. You're doing the second one. So I don't know if anybody else wants to like add something or ask questions.
I guess to me the energumen concept to me is suggesting that capitalism is really about circulation. It's about energetics. It's about movement and constant. And that really is what Keynes says. I mean, you know, he says that's why you have to you know, regulate and put injections of money into, you know, put money in people's pockets in various ways, because money has to circulate for capitalism to work. And if it's not circulating, then you get a recession or a depression. So I don't know. Personally, I do think that this reading is somewhat Keynesian. It's not Keynesian in terms of like its finality, but there's a Keynesian element to it.
Yeah.
No, say goodnight, John.
But yeah, we can move on to the next reading if we want to.
I don't want to cut anybody off, but the one thing that I do want to say is I think you're right about the energetics, but I really do want to press this idea of a kind of radical libidinal possession, and I think that he doesn't say it because there's such a kind of I like Lyotard. I mean, as I've read a lot of him, and I know Jason and I were chatting on Facebook earlier about him not being a fan, and I'm not a fan in quite the same way, but stylistically, he has a lot of interesting moves that he makes, and I think one of them is articulating through silence, is pushing these things. So the one thing I do want to say is, especially if we're talking about the transition from an energumen capitalism to a libidinal economy, and especially if we're presenting this to more and more students across the globe and people from different formations, backgrounds. You know, one of the critical things I think that Lyotard puts on the map is the possession by capital, right? He talks about these transient cathexis in page 1876, sorry, 186 or something like this. And what this means is that any form of energy can sort of cut across any other. So we're always in a kind of substitutional matrix. And this is a real way to get at people, I think, as pedagogues, as teachers, and as scholars and interlocutors. It's a way of talking about this, right? That we're possessed by these modes of libidinal investment and libidinal output. So that's just something that spoke to me. And thank you guys for the opportunity to do this.
Yeah, thank you. That's
welcome.
Great.
So Laura, we're going to be hearing from you now.
Yeah. Okay, I guess a lot of the things that Carlos talks about are reflected also in this piece from Libidinal Economy, which, brief introduction, it was written in 1974, just 2 years after 1000 Plateau, Anti-Oedipus, and it is basically it starts on the same trajectory. It kind of reflects, especially in the style, I think, in the writing, it's these super long sentences and then it reflects the kind of the passion, I guess, of May '68 and I guess a kind of disappointment with the Marxist response to those events. So I guess the main point, the main argument in this excerpt is that there is a desire that is immanent to capital, which is errant and that inhabits the margins, or better, the marginals at the very beginning, which I guess it may even refer to, I don't know, to the law of marginal utility or this, this difference, I guess, that I don't know, just a thought. Anyway, so the desire of capital manifests or is invested in most it reflects in labor, in the object in time, and in the system where we see, as we were saying before, this congruence between science and capital. And it gives rise to these vertiginous intensities that, on the other hand, double in a kind of masochism or hysteria, which is, for instance, which is reflected, for instance, in the example of the English proletariat, that, according to Lyotard, were kind of enjoying the fact of being exterminated by their labor. So by what labor had done to their body, but he's sort of highlighting the fact that it's their labor. So they were willing to accept, like almost enjoying the pain and the pain of labor that capital was imposing onto their body. So he opens this little I don't know, this parenthesis about the fact that in a way capital doesn't leave any choice. It is there enduring the pain and labor and kind of enjoying it or dying. So this that or die is, according to him, the law of libidinal economy, or better, the definition. It is not the price, but it is what makes it unpayable. So basically, the point is that there is no alternative. Death, as like the death drive, I suppose, is not an alternative to labor and to capital, but it's part of it. And again, it comes from this jouissance that is in labor. It is in the enjoyment, in the destruction caused by capital, which I guess is part of his accelerationist moment. This jouissance by which the workers enjoy their own destruction by labor, according to Lyotard, is the same of prostitution, which has got an element of anonymity, repetition. Again, it is not a matter of production, but of endurance. And this endurance, on the other side, causes an anesthetization, I guess, of the torture that capital imposes on workers. And but this desire is not. Lyotard makes clear that he doesn't say this in a what is it? He doesn't. It's not an accusation that he does towards the workers, but it's actually here in this desire and this response that workers can that lies this force of resistance of the workers, as for instance it is for prostitutes, the fact of being anesthetized, hysterically anesthetized through use, through being used, that lies the resistance of the worker. He then goes on by inviting to give up on the idea of alienation, because he says there is not an organic body that is alienated from capital, from machine. Everything is fragmented. So the organic body is a fantasy that perhaps has also been forged by, is a fantasy that has been kind of forged by Marxism itself, I think. And this kind of critique that Lyotard does to, like when he talks about workers, obviously he mainly talks about manual labor, he talks about the Scottish miners, but also perhaps today it could, I don't know, it could reflect in anything that is happening in, again, in cognitive labor, in these competitive schemes by which workers get to enjoy, need to enjoy what they're doing, I guess. And sorry, I was reading the comments by Carlos. But he also, again, I don't know, I guess he takes this idea of jouissance as, again, he talks obviously from the point of view of the human when he says that the jouissance is unbearable. For instance, I don't know, I was thinking that it is unbearable by humans, but not perhaps that by contemporary machines that today are able to code also this desire that, as you were saying before, is quantified, and even according to Lyotard, it manifests or is endured in quantity, and it manifests, and it, I guess, like propagate through quantification. He talks about this ambivalence then in Capital, this ambivalence which lies in this jouissance, which made me think about Baudrillard's book Seduction. So it's kind of, there is always this seduction, a double movement about this functionality and dysfunctionality in Capital that is already immanent to it. So again, desire is a matter of endurance, and is a matter of quantity, it's a matter of fragmentation, and this is here that, and these are the points that Lyotard, I guess, wants to accelerate to its most extreme consequences. He kind of does at some point a critique to the intellectual class about not speaking the truth, which I guess is or should be a kind of auto-critique, although at the end he seems to put himself more on the side of the workers when he says that we prefer to burst under the quantitative excess that you judge the most stupid. So it's kind of accusing the intellectual class to become a leader of men, to become pimps, literally, like towards the like worker prostitutes in a way. He critiques Castoriadis that we mentioned last week, and his idea of kind of fighting or countering the alienation of man with creativity and spontaneity. He calls generalized creativity the abominable super-made thing. As I said, I'm reading it from the actual book, so this is page 116. I don't know exactly what it is on the reader. And according to him, there is, I think, from my understanding, because I think I find it a bit unclear here, there is no such a thing as a creativity that can counter this idea of alienation. First of all, because according to him, there is no alienation. There is this, I guess, I don't know, reading in Baudrillard, or calling Baudrillard's term, I guess there is this kind of seduction, this kind of, what he says at some point, that the master or the boss that refuses to be the boss in order to be the true master. Page 119 of the book. The dirty little ambivalence, the master becoming the servant and thereby becoming or re-becoming the true master. So to him, the only way, I guess, to get out of this situation, of this impasse, is by renouncing on this idea of revolution. To restart the revolution is not to begin it, it is to cease to see the world alienated. So, and it is here that he, I guess, he's arguing for an investment in quantity and in fragmentation, because as there is no organic body for a libidinal economy towards the end, there is no more even a libidinal body. This libidinal body is another kind of what he calls a strange compromise of a concept from Western medicine and physiology, with the idea of the libido as energy subject to the indispensable regimes of eros and death. He's obviously critiquing, I guess, Freud, but towards the end, I think, was an important point that I kind of, I guess, didn't really perhaps understand altogether. Well, he talks about the real schism of the body that capital creates is the schism between the body, which is reduced to a machinery, and the mind or the brain, which is the software, right, of like the intellectual labor. But then he also, to understand this, when this scission happens, he refers to François Guéry and his understanding of a medieval corporation, so or eternal corporation. For Guéry, during the eternal corporation, the man's head is machined by the corporation, but it is an organic part of the body. So, in a way, the corporation is a non-hierarchical body, but on conditions that the appearance of speech as political techne is not taken into account. So, what I didn't really understood here, if it's arguing for a sort of like, or if it's sort of drawing a line in between the economic corporation and then what is perhaps today anyway the combination of the economic corporation with the political techne, with politics. I'm not sure. I'd like actually to get some opinion about this. So
we're almost at the end. You're almost at the end of the essay.
Yeah, we're very much at the end. There's I guess what he's sort of arguing for is that renouncing to alienation, renouncing this fantasy of the organic body which doesn't exist, and accepting the fact that under capital everything is quantified and fragmented in a way that could be accelerated to its most to its most extreme consequences,
So what?
And looking for this. Yeah.
Go ahead. Finish. I want to ask you a question.
Oh yeah, I was just saying, and looking for these unheard of intensities that could perhaps I don't know. To be honest, I don't see where it wants to go from there. It's I get it, this idea of the immanence of a desire in capital, but I don't understand what he actually wants to do. He was critiquing Castoriadis for his idea of like pointing on creativity, but what he's suggesting, which he said at some point towards the end, I don't really. Sorry, I'm looking for it. Can't find it. I don't really see where he wants to go, I guess.
Okay. My question was,
yeah.
Reading this, I sort of like, I want to know what you think. Reading this, I sort of saw where an extreme form of post-structuralism will just lead to something like CCU and Nick Land. Like it's like this is what happens. This is what happens when you push post-structuralism to a statement like things being the center of speech and sword sets up no less of a hierarchization of these pulsions and social entities where they give way to free play in a privileged way. You know that sentence at the end of the second last paragraph, right?
Yeah.
So what do you think? I kept seeing sort of like ghosts of Nick Land all over this, right? Whereas we know Nick Land was supposed to be a break with post-structuralism. But it's fascinating how this history that Robin is creating kind of like really puts these schools of thought in relation to each other and shows the overlaps, the ebbs and flows and overlaps.
Which is.
Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say that this is perhaps what Benjamin was pointing at the beginning, is that it's nothing extremely new about, I don't know. Well, I guess this is what contemporary accelerationism is trying to overcome, but there is a tradition in that.
I'm trying to get John to somehow say something, and the next one hopefully will make John say something. Oh my God, I'm trying to make John say something, and there comes like a huge piece of text being posted by John to the sidebar. But you know, to me, it also looks like another attempt as a form of philosophical cybernetics, the last paragraph, right? Where, and you pointed out to it throughout your presentation, right? Symbolic exchange is also a political economic exchange, just as the law of civic speaking in Athens, and the tetralogos is also a law of the mercantilization of discourse, and complementary, just as a scrupulous fragmentation of tasks in the regulated disciplines implies their subordination to a central zero, while not being professional, perhaps, is no less the caput of the alleged social body, right? And how basically we're dealing with a system of quantification system of fragments and their interaction, and like this immanence is like a computational immanence. The immanence that he's kind of like suggesting is a computational immanence. The word missing to me is to sort of like say, yes, capital is an algorithm for the conversion of qualities into quantities and back. But a complex general algorithm that in each case goes in, sets up the rate of exchange, sets up the speed of exchange, and basically gets to work in turning qualities into quantities and quantities back into qualities.
yeah, it's perfectly true. We could just read it, or like read this immanence of desire as a positive feedback loop or the negative feedback loop. So again, what Lyotard wants to do is create or accelerate this positive feedback loop, and and fly into the libidinal economy.
To
as
me,
it says at some point was yeah.
To me, the problem is, again, vitalism, which is all over this, right? All over it is vitalism, and the fact that this invisible hand, like if we so like trace in political economy, if we trace the vitalism of this particular piece, or this vitalism that Nick Land and others attribute to the machine, or the machine of capital, right, to Adam Smith's invisible hand, right, we forget that there's a black box there, in which there's a conspiracy going on in the black box, because we know there's like human interest and human hands are somehow behind the scene making things look 100% emergent and, you know, voluntarism, where, as we know, in the last instance you have the black box overriding the invisible hand. So this is what's missing from, and that's why, to me, at the end of the day, it's a white flag rather than a type of critique of capitalism or understanding of capitalism that wants to provide some form of a point of agency or point of, I don't know, progress or change. As interesting as it is to read and see it as a part of a history of acceleration, I find it kind of like intellectual charlatanism of French post-structuralism is still all over it.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I didn't. Yeah, the analogy with cybernetics didn't come out that clear to me at the beginning, but it's, yeah, now that you said it, it's actually everywhere. And this is my problem, for instance, with the CCRU or with Nick Land, like of those days. Again, it's this idea of acceleration to the, you know, I don't know, this positive feedback loop, but where does it go? I don't know. I don't really. Again, it's just, okay. It's trying to, I guess, find the abstraction of capital with I don't know, with another abstraction. I don't know. This is why I don't like the word abstraction, I guess, because it doesn't lead anywhere to me. Like, I don't know. I don't really see where it's going. Although obviously, yeah, you can see, I guess, how, I don't know, to me, the thing that really came, like, I don't know, across to me again is this idea of like how cybernetic capital, or how contemporary like capitalism is actually perhaps able, like, I don't know, it sort of laid this idea of quantification and fragmentation, like all these little bits already discrete and perhaps distributed, that now are, I guess, more easily captured by capital, like literally like overcoded or recoded into capital. I was thinking about Google search algorithm is perhaps a great example of libidinal economy that reflects in the financial market as well. Apparently, I don't know if it's only voices or that's really true, because it's really hard to find actual like information about it, but apparently they are using, or they're like studying the, I don't know, like the search, they're studying like the global movements of like search words on Google to predict movements on the market. So that it speaks to me as like a great example of libidinal economy.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's exactly what I don't know where it was going, but it made me think of that. So
maybe we should turn to Tony, because he's going to also discuss this text to get another reading of it. Tony, are you there?
Mm-hmm.
There we go. Hello, how you doing?
Hi, how are you?
Good, thanks. You look like Mao Tse-tung.
Yeah, but,
As you close your button up, you look like Mao.
all right.
And maybe it's up to you how you want to do it, but but maybe if you want to respond a little bit to Laura in some way.
Yeah, totally. That would be good. Also, that would be a good start to respond to Laura.
Okay. So the question ends. Laura ends like, I don't know what he wants to do, what he's going to do with it, what he wants to do with it. Then to take, since you did a great, Laura, you did a great some of the entire work. I don't need to go through it too much. Just bring up a few extra quotes. We had Benjamin Noys on. So as most of you know, he basically positions Lyotard to be this book, the Libidinal Economy, as a accelerationist book. To quote him, Lyotard puts, I quote, "In the immense and vicious circuits of capital exchanges, whether of commodities or services, it appears that all modalities of jouissance are possible and that none of it are ostracized." So, yeah, we have like in Lyotard's case, we have general statement that he's the general summation of this, right, is that he's addressing our desires, our investments, our enjoyment of capitalism, and sort of I think Simon O'Sullivan kind of glances over this like in his review. I'm trying to think of like what he's trying to do, and the only way I can think of it is perhaps like what is the importance of the libidinal economy, I guess, for new accelerationism, maybe in this debate between Nick Land and the left accelerationists, what it could be for, and then so really, I don't know. There's so Mo brought up. I'm trying to like skim through what I've already prepared to respond to Laura. I'm sorry if this is a little less formal, but I think what's important about Schoenstatt and Williams is that they're trying to somehow remotivate people, or to have a new investment, to have in order to sort of, they're moving towards ways of mapping or planning out new futures, of ways of doing so. But in order to do so, I think there's actually an interview that Stegler does on Libidinal Economy where he's talking about very much the same thing that Schoenstatt and Williams are talking about. And I do think this all has relations, so I'll bring it back. But he says, Stegler says in an interview, that one must from now on rebuild a new public space, regimes of singularities within a technical organization, and reinvent a new public thing that is capable of producing long-term politics. And I think a lot of people on this new movement are embracing this as a route of saving the future, or like Benjamin Noys talks about it as an exit of our present moment, and how we might reuse when they'll be repurposed. And I think this is quite interesting because in the Libidinal Economy book, he's talking a lot about motivations and investments, and he's actually talking about an investment in the capitalist system. And in the quote, he says, "Investment in the system, in value in the constitution of pieces of the libidinal band, in terms of which only have value through difference or reference, and in the establishment of the laws and these cross references. That is to say, the deranged investment in the bond and its accomplice lack. One doesn't even ask for the lack of it as much as having any other." So then he's relating to the Freudian libidinal economy, and he's saying, can't this give rise to vertiginous intensities? He makes a relation between Einstein and his most artistic inventions are driven by his desire that that God is not playing a role in this. So there is this sort of, I think, if we're thinking like positionist within the accelerationist reader, what's really important about libidinal economy for perhaps the Schoenrich and Williams project is remotivation and sort of a reorganization of these libidinal.
No, you're absolutely right. This is really the project. The project is like, okay, if you want to map everything out in terms of the sentient, right? If you want to map everything out either as biological or psychological and natural, right?
Yep.
We must create the new space in the space of reason, because this type of mapping, this immanent mapping, would leave no room for anything. So you have to actually construct an outside, and the outside can only be constructed out of the alien force of reason, because the political economic cybernetics is going to, like, has already mapped out the whole world, whether it's biological or psychological or anthropological.
I think this is what's really interesting about what Noys said when he was relating hyperstition to libidinal economy. Like, right, you have like libidinal economy, hyperstition, CCRU, and then theory fiction. There's a mass relation here in organizing libidinal forces. The way that you read Nick Landry, the same way you read Deleuze and Guattari, you get that sort of feeling. Like, really, there's a motivating force in the writing styles and perhaps in the practices they're trying to develop. And it also, like Stegler's even also like echoing this when he's talking, and he's talking about elevation of collective intelligence through relaunching of desire. I think that this is quite, if you think about all these sorts of things converging, all these quotes, they're all kind of trying to negotiate this, like how to, Stegler's talking about, is it Stegler or I might be mixing, 1 second, sorry. Yeah, so he's talking about, Stegler, just before this relaunching of desire, he's saying if you want to think about the future of the planet in terms of the climate, for example, then individual behaviors need to be transformed. The individuals must become more conscious and more attentive to what they surrounds them. They must turn to what surrounds them into objects of desire. So this is sort of a very interesting way of using, I think, the libidinal economy. I don't know if that answers anything, Laura.
I wish Carlos would say why. I mean, I love Laruelle, and I just saw you like that the image of my non-photography essay on Facebook. So if you could tell me, why do you think that this reading is Laruellian?
And then I think because if I read, and I really liked Tony's interventions, especially bringing it to Stegler, because I'm woefully behind on his work, so it's really inspiring. I think there's a certain flattening of reason that I'm insisting upon in my own direction with regards to Lyotard and in libidinal economy and in energumen capital, that reason has to be a kind of thing that emerges from without, right? There's this force of reason or thought, to use Badiou's term. But I think that what you're actually saying is there's something epiphenomenal within. And I think that's what Laruelle would say. He's like resisting the decisionism. That's why I'm twitting you, I'm teasing you in the sidebars about not being an accelerationist, about being an anarcho-scientist, but not really. Because I think that there's a kind of decisionism that, Jason has pointed it out in some of the things that he said. Everybody pointed it out. Laura did in some of her critiques of the notion of the abstract. That is apparent in all of this accelerationist project, which is to kind of decide to repress agency or to repress reason. And you're seeing, I think, as an emergence of the real. It's kind of a gnosis moment, a non-thought in the last instance, as Laruelle would say. But I'm totally a Laruellian at heart, so
you are.
That's
come
me.
to New York for the New Schools Conference.
Oh, okay, there we go.
I think it's next. I think it's October 30th, right? With Alex Galloway and Anthony Paul Smith and a whole bunch of other people are doing a Laruelle. Ed Keller. I can send you the thing. But anyways, that's just beside the point. Well, for me, really, my thing has been to somehow reconcile what these people are talking about with Laruelle's critique of metaphysics. So I guess to some, and I also think like aesthetics, the aesthetic theory of Laruelle is much more suited to talk about like I mean, more than his philosophical ideas, I think his aesthetic theories that comes through his non-photography book and the photo fiction are much more suitable for a rigorous aesthetics for acceleration rather than what Alex Williams talk about in the efflux essay in terms of like aesthetics of information and scientific images and all that. I think Reza's kind of like indirectly picking it up by embracing abstraction and kind of like, because I kept talking about how the only aesthetic for acceleration is abstraction, and I remember, I mean, I'm on tape asking these questions last year when they were talking in New York. No, Alex is not on Facebook. There, Ray and Reza and Sohail Malik were talking at Miguel Abro, and this was when Reza finally gave up on speculative realism and sort of like talked about reason and talked about rationality, sitting right next to Ray. And I basically talked about how the only type of aesthetics that really can be utilized for this type of philosophy is abstraction. And Sohail kind of like opposed me because he said no, abstraction comes from a particular history of abstract expressionism, avant-gardism, and it's exhausted. But no, my messages aren't coming through. Oh, never mind. Is that you, Tony?
No.
But because somebody, but Reza's kind of going back to abstraction in the newest piece he wrote for Jean-Luc Moulet's show at the Miguel Abro. I have a copy of it. It's not scanned yet. Yeah. So and I think what Laruelle suggests is the sort of like abandoning of the image of the world.
Yeah.
The realist image. But so much of acceleration is still trying to figure out the place of realism and the place of what is the role of manifest image. We argue about that all the time, and everybody, all my friends, tell me, but you haven't given us your theory of aesthetics. And I'm like, well, I will introduce it next month in LA a little bit, and then with the talk I'm doing with Reza in Australia, it'll be full blown out what I'm talking about. So I'm kind of holding my cards a little bit closer to my chest because I don't want to like put my both feet in my mouth. I think I already got one in my mouth. I don't want to, because then I won't have a leg to stand on, as they say. So, Tony, sorry, we interrupted your presentation.
I don't mind.
So go ahead, you can continue.
Well, actually, I would like to know if at all that it answers that in some way to what Laura's question is at the end. I mean, it's not what perhaps Leotard's trying to do, but it's what is happening or what has become from it. Maybe not.
What do you mean?
Well, I was trying to respond to I guess Laura by.
Oh, okay.
In some way, but I don't know. I probably went off. I don't know. I mean, I guess that's like that's my biggest point, I guess, out of this paper. Other than that, I think I would just go back through and summarize things that Laura said.
Do you want to just like maybe cover up some of the stuff that came to your mind and run us through the essay? It would be nice.
Okay.
Jason, you look like a photograph. Are you real or that's your picture?
He is very photogenic.
Yeah, he is.
Oh, I didn't know my mic was on. Sorry.
Your microphone is off.
I said videogenic maybe. I'm not usually that photogenic.
Goes back to what I think is interesting in the left accelerationist perhaps politics. He says that there are no libidinal dignity nor libidinal fraternity. There are libidinal contacts without communication, in parentheses, for want of a message. This is why amongst individuals participating in the same struggle there may exist the most profound miscomprehension, even if they are situated within the same social economic bracket. I think this. I don't know if anybody has anything to say to this quote, actually, in particular to maybe recent events or anything, but I think this is quite interesting in relation to sort of how hypersession functions.
The human.
You know, just trying to.
Go ahead. I just remember something that I wanted to bring up and maybe ask Laura or ask you, right? Which is sort of like how he associates with the happy worker as a sort of like return to the primitive society. That he says there's this like thing running through Marxism by idealizing the future post-capitalist world as the state in which workers are all happy and everybody knows what they're doing and they're creative and they're fun. And he says, isn't this sort of like how the primitive societies are, and isn't it sort of like retrograde rather than progress?
This is at the end of the paper, right?
Yeah, totally. Right? Is it at the end? Yeah.
Yeah.
But I can't find it because the
error. He talks about the error which appeared to be beyond an error detail is the fantasy, so powerful and constant in the best Marxist heritage of a happy state of the working body.
It's up there, right? Is the last page on the top, right?
Yeah. Again, this goes back to what you were talking about with the idea of exchange.
I think this guy has never worked himself because he fetishized. You know, like, I mean, he's doing what other intellectuals have done. He's kind of like an inverse version of, you know, Marx is fetishizing labor. He's fetishizing labor.
Am I wrong here, though, to think that he's saying we should look beyond this error because this is an error that leads to like spiritualization, subordination to essential zero, like, or is he's actually saying he's critiquing this happy state of the working body, right?
He's critiquing. He's saying it's a fantasy. It's a fantasy just as much as a. I think he's saying it's a fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
But I think
it's a fantasy about the unity of all parts, whereas he would say that this is not. You can never have a wholly unified happy body. The working body as a whole is not existing.
Well, he also, that notion of the primitive society, I think, really, I mean, I think this is a critique launched at Baudrillard in a very specific way, sort of around the horn, but I think you're right about the political totality. It's fantasizing an outside. That's the term I'm trying to get at. And I think that's what it seems to be saying, that, you know, it's also a political exchange, but it's something that is extrinsic, and he resists that. He seems to refuse it. I agree with you.
Right. I wonder if that's like the libidinal state that land takes, then, sort of in this neo-reactionary movement. But I can't say more on that.
I'm going to. But I kept looking. I was going to read this at the end of Laura's presentation, but I will read it now, if you don't mind, and it will be a good little piece to sort of like end this talk of like vitalist political economy that he sets forth, you know. And I'm going to read from the unpublished book of Chatelet for you, just like a little bit. That's sort of like, I think it will be a great closing. Money. It's the oh so simple miracle that allows you to take home veal in your shopping bag. The trader knights repeat, forgetting that behind the head of veal or the pork cutlet there is a futures market in livestock and pork bellies, and that behind that market looms a futures market of exchange rates, interest rates, and so many other levels, all the way down to obsolete volatility, all utterly inaccessible to those bit part players in the great comedy of trading, the small individual shareholders or the workers, the carpenters and the carpenter's widow with investment, or the chair attendant in the Rambouillet Park. Indeed, it will be indecorous to speak of the neutrality of money to the turbulent nights of speculation, to the great priest of the fluid and the chaotic, virtuosos of mimetic contagions and self-validating strategies, the masters of credit who can pay with the future, who can impose their debt as means of payment, and thus ensure their mastery of economic horizons. Our knights love to democratically savor the market, but this market is not fluid and homogeneous like the one that is offered to the carpenter's widow or to the second-tier citizen. The latter are kindly requested to know their place, that of the domesticity, and not to get too close to the true market, that of the connoisseurs, the market makers, who know very well that it can never be reduced to a simple balance of payments, but is a taking control, that the value of a company is increasingly linked to the way it is managed, and above all, to anticipations of control, that accountability is not objective but objectivating, that any calculations concerning real value, fundamental parameters, must always be rebalanced by a pre-market value which completely escapes the criteria of symmetry of information, and which is fabricated by the bubble rumors far removed from the elegant cries of neoclassical economics. The trader sees himself as valiant and dramatic, always at the outpost of volatility, upstream of what he just been prepared as the new raw materials of the market, and ready to confront head-on the great dragon of contingency. And then there's these amazing quotes from the mouth of the trader, which totally speaks to the side of the market that you don't see footsteps of it anywhere near this type of Lyotard's understanding of capitalism, which is the black box. You hear all about the cybernetic invisible hand, the particles, how the libidinal and the textual and the forces all turn into little pieces and interact to create this economy. But you don't hear that there's another force inside, which is those whose power is accumulating in the form of capital, who have a vested interest. And to me, I'm just gonna maybe end with this, and I'm kind of working this into my paper, which I'm writing for Los Angeles, and which is, you guys all know how the Benjamin's thesis on the history of philosophy begin, right? With the Turkish automaton, right? Most people are familiar with that, right? And so to me, the black box is really the henchman in the machine that is still pulling or trying its best to pull all the levers and to make something that has a sort of like vested interest of powerful human in it, kind of like invisible to the public who really sees it as a sort of like a machinic wonder. And the job would be to sort of like to objectively figure out how these two forces, the forces of chaos, of information and biology and sentience, and the forces of powerful who want to somehow get a hold of this, who want to quantify all qualities and qualify quantities when needed, kind of interact and put them in the right place, you know? And that the piece by Lyotard is a great sort of like piece in this trajectory of realizing how economy works beyond the basic Marxism that he's criticizing, or the French Marxists that he's sort of like French Marxists at the time that he's making fun of. But to go beyond this and sort of like return to some form of scientific understanding of political economy. So
I want to read this
Jason,
book. You talk about it so much.
yeah, it's so amazing, man. It's the best book of the year, and it's gonna come out very soon. And there's some minor changes being done to it, because I was talking to Catherine, and she said that there's minor changes being done to this, and also like they're picking up with little text on the back of the book, because ergonomic books usually get a little one sentence in the back, and they're debating what sentence should go to the back of the book.
Is there going to be
yeah, are
they going to make an ebook?
Ebook just like every other what do you call it? Every other
Urbanomic?
Urbanomics. Sometimes you get the ebook or not.
What's the title
what,
again?
It's called To Live and Think Like Pigs: The Incitement of Envy and Boredom in Market Democracies. So to Chatelet, what capitalism creates en masse, basically among the knights and among the regular citizens, is only reproduction of envy and boredom as the two sides of this life cycle. You're either bored or you're envious of others. And here goes what happens to class. Class struggle turns into envy. And also, he's not very down on the pigs. He's basically down on the urban middle class in the SUVs. And he kind of makes that clear in the beginning of the book, that like when he talks about the pig, the title of the book does not relate to the pig, because pigs are like dignified animals, but he's referring to the urban middle class in their SUVs. That's the pig. And you know, he's very hard on Lyotard. This book is like a big attack on post-structuralists. And he also has a glossary at the end, and he actually cynically defines what post-structuralism is, or postmodernism is. He called them post-philosophers, actually, to all of them. And he says, this tendency or movement could also be called post-industrial, post-cynicism, or really, from now on, post-anything. It is defined as that which sees modernity as behind it, or as that which shuffles the cards of modernity. Let us note how the principle that governs anarcho-mercantilist versus anarcho-mercantilist, do good without harming anyone, agrees very well with the tartuffery of postmodernism. Make vogues without making any waves, which along with its language games, its micro decisions, it's yes, no, perhaps, it's rightly or wrongly, always ends up sitting idly by. Let us not forget that anarcho-mercantilists anarcho-mercantilism is at its keenest when spiced up with a bit of creativity and a pinch of the tragic. This is where two old buddies of postmodernism come in: chaos and radical evil. And goes on for another last 2 page, kind of like it's a direct attack on postmodernists and post-structuralists. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the class. Jason, do you want to have anything to say at the end?
I would like to call attention to my class, which is starting on, I believe, on Sunday and Wednesdays. Starting this coming Sunday, it's going to be a class on kind of the political theory of decisionism. We kind of talked just briefly about that in the sidebar. Is there a decisionist moment in energy-men capitalism or in contemporary capitalism? In, for example, the decision to even extend the possibility of credit in the first place, and what role does that have in a kind of rhizomatic capitalist society? And so this is going to be coming up, and we're going to have. I'll tell you guys in the Hangout. Well, no, I can't because it's going to be archived. So I don't know for sure all of the guests, but I know at least we'll have Jasper Puar will be one of the guests. She's the author of Terrorist Assemblages. and some really good critiques of intersectionality theory from a Deleuzian perspective. And she's really pretty interesting the way that she uses Agamben and kind of state of exception type theory, and then combines it with Deleuze. So she'll be one of the guests, and then we'll also have Jerome Luce, who's the person behind Roar magazine. He wrote a pretty interesting essay about kind of reading what was happening in Ferguson through kind of Agambenian decisionist theory. So he'll be one of the guests, and we're just going to go through basically, from Hobbes to Schmidt, and then coming back up to Fouar, Nigarithani, and Akile Mbembe, looking at more recent uses of this type of theory, and particularly responses against this type of theory as well. So should be interesting. And the final guest, who I can't name, I think will be, hopefully
put it in the chat.
Hopefully who?
Oh yeah, I could put it in the chat. So I'm gonna write in the chat.
Is it that secret?
Yes. Well, I mean,
I'm hearing it for the first time here too. So it's like this is not like a.
Just don't verbalize it, because just don't say it out loud, okay?
Because it may not happen.
Because it may not happen. But this person may say yes, or may not say yes. I should know by tomorrow. But somebody who I think has a really great handle on Schmidt, and is just an all-around really kind of insightful radical theorist.
I posted all the comments and the sidebar stuff except this last thing in the classroom. So I just did it just before you posted that. So it's up. Also, for Laura and Ivan and others who are doing the full course, you got assignments that you have to finish, but we're given sort of like till next Monday, right? To finish all those. So there's 3 more pieces of writing. You shouldn't have any problem, because your presentation was really good, and you can kind of like put it together and somehow relate it to your last one, because I think it's very much related to the piece that you sent to us. And yeah, so basically we're looking forward to those in order to be able to evaluate you, and also to tell you that we're ending the semester with the second part of the Accelerate, to kind of like think about that will be essential to take the second part, to kind of like finish the book. But also I'm trying my best to get the authors, like to get Ray and Reza to come to the class, at least, if not more people from the bunch. Meaning, I also would like to get basically my choices for the guests are Robin, Alex Williams, Reza, and Ray Brazier, to kind of like go over. But there's so many interesting people like Patricia Reed, which I'm also like thinking, because it's always good to have like the feminist and the female perspective in, and others. But we may end up doing more than 4 guests. So some sessions bring 2 people, because these are like living figures. They're not like Marx and Lyotard and all that. They're not dead, and they're amongst us. They're friends, and we can get them. So yeah. So I'm looking also forward to end the season with the second part of the book. Having said that, so please contact us if you have any questions about the assignments and about sort of like fulfilling the requirements of the course. Also, I want to add, we are launching the certificate programs very soon with like, and those of you who are interested in sort of like receiving a certificate program, receiving a certificate from the new center, can put this credit once you actually get it, after fulfilling the requirements. You can put these towards a number of the certificates that we're offering. Actually, the book program's designed in a way that probably you can put it towards any of the certificates, but it'll be up to the programmers to kind of like negotiate and put these and take their tuition off the certificate, the tuition that you paid off the certificate. And sort of like work it that way. But there's going to be more detail about that, and also about the scholarship and all that will come up on our website in the next week or so. So you should be able to sort of like look at all that and make your decision about like what are you going to do and what are you going to take later. Anyways, if you don't have any questions, we would like to say
and
goodbye.
also for those who became members, or if you're not a member yet, or you're thinking about becoming one, one of the main points of the new center is really to have a research community, and have people who you can exchange ideas with, and have some sense of a common project. And so we're going to be rolling out Google communities where this kind of thing can happen, and that'll be part of the membership. That's not right away, but
also any of you who are interested in working more closely with any of our guests, just let us know in private emails and let us know what your interests are working with them. We're more than happy to facilitate a sort of like more direct and concrete contact between you or any of the guests that we bring to our classes, or any of the people beside me and Jason who are going to teach, basically. Anyway, so this is sort of like the end of our very first seminar, and I want to thank you all for signing up and for being part of it and for supporting us and for taking part in. Carlos is back, for supporting us with your time and your resources and all that. And yeah, and thank you, Tony, for sort of like
thank you guys for a wonderful first course. And
look at that pillow intellectual.
Thank you guys. Yeah, it's been fantastic.
They call them armchair intellectual. We should call you like the pillow intellectual.
It's a good pillow.
I bet. Anyways, thank you very much. And Tony put that picture of like Kafka in the background, I think, with the blood stain on it. I don't know what are you trying to say with that, but it's beautiful.
It's a bag. It's my friend makes them for the Kafka Museum in Prague. I don't know.
Jason, Tony's joining us from Glasgow now, so he's no longer in North America, and he's beginning his own sort of like research and work at the Glasgow University, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be hearing from you on email. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Ciao.